Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
It was cold and people were huddled together. A young girl who was standing on the platform timidly looked around. She didn't like being so nervous. All these months, as she had planned the event, she had been calm, but now for some reason she was terribly nervous. Sometimes she felt like her heart was shaking. "Excuse me, may I see your ID?" the police officer said as she approached the platform exit. Yes, sorry," she said my words with her head. "That's okay. Everyone is a little unassembled this early," said the man with a smile, returning her documents. Kelly stepped out onto the platform. It was a little warmer here than in Moscow. The wind that gave away everything inside the station seemed to be less harsh. Kelly walked over to a bench and sat down so that it would blow less on her. People were walking around like a penguin, flopping from one foot to the other. Some hugged themselves with both arms, others leaned in close. It was cold. A dark blue bus with white stripes showed up on the horizon. Soon it was pulling onto the platform and people were approaching the entrance. Again, the checking of documents, tickets. That was it. It was okay to get on. As soon as Kelly climbed the steps, sat down in her seat, she immediately felt that she was gradually beginning to warm up to her father. All she wanted was for the bus to move, and for the people filling it to breathe. Everyone came in, rubbing their palms or rubbing their forearms. No one had expected that spring could be so pro-Moscow at night. But there were those who managed to put on warm jackets and now watched the irresponsible passengers with triumphant smiles. When the bus filled up, the driver got behind the wheel. Kelly put her headphones in her ears. No one sat down next to her. The bus was half empty. Apparently, all those people waiting on the platform. They were going to take a completely different route. Smooth music started playing. Kelly switched to rock. Right now, she wanted a distraction to make the nervousness stop. A woman came in with a folder, asking a question. Where she took off her headphones, the woman repeated it. "So who's going to the settlement? Put your hands up." "Yeah, I see," she said and made a few marks. "A. Fedorov, not so good. There's someone else who goes out to the small villages." I said Kelly, and then I said the name of the village. "Okay, guys, sleep. Don't worry. I'll tell the driver. He'll stop if there's anything to wake you up." "Good roads," she said, smiling, and got out. Kelly put the headphones back in her ears. The bus moved off a little while later. Pretty soon gray, unattractive. The station with the broken clock was gone. The city's high-rise buildings appeared. After a few more minutes, the private sector began, and in another 3 o'clock, the city disappeared. Lawn fields, forests, strips of land black from the fertile soil, and over it all stretched a gray sky that had yet to turn blue before dawn. Kelly closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Right now, the sooner she fell asleep, the better. After a few minutes, she fell into a restless sleep with constant awakenings. Still, it was better than staring at the road for long hours. A large, busy village spread out on the plain. Somewhere in the distance could be seen the tops of a forest. The river, which ran along the entire forested area unheard, ran between the rocks. From early morning and even before dawn, the voices of people were heard. Apparently, it was the gathering of those who were working in the city. The old woman woke up with the first rays of the sun. She still couldn't get used to this house that her son had given her relatively recently. The village where Betty had lived all her life had gradually died out. It was dangerous to stay there. Her son had moved Betty to a new place, bought her a nice new house, and now the old woman woke up and could hardly remember where she was. She had a sheet by her bedside with everything signed on it. Her illness was draining her of her last strength. Betty, with her will in her fist, continued to live, or at least tried to keep her activities stable. "Good morning, Betty," said the neighbor with a smile. A young woman was already standing near the bushes, watering the roses. The sun was slowly rising over the houses, whimsically illuminating the roofs in warm hues. "Good morning, but tonight is the night." "Wow," said the elderly woman. "Oh, don't tell me. We didn't expect it ourselves. We even put the heater on. It's spring already. It's like summer days are just around the corner." "And I was afraid that the roses would freeze," said the neighbor. The older woman nodded. She smiled a little, and then concentrated, looked around at the young trees that her son had recently planted. Apparently it was just cold, but it hadn't gotten to frost. She smiled because she was relieved that the trouble had passed. "Why are you here so early?" "Retirement, it's beautiful. And you don't have a vegetable garden as such. Everything's in greenhouses. It's time to get some sleep." The neighbor continued with a smile. "Oh, in the other world you laughed," said Betty. She frantically tried to remember the name of the neighbor, but cannot sleep in her old age. "My son is coming today. We need to prepare food, set the table. And it's a habit when you get up at dawn for decades. No old age can help you forget it." The neighbor nodded understandingly. The man came out, said something to her, and then disappeared back into the house. Betty went into the greenhouse, checked everything, and then returned to the house. She had to get ready for her son's arrival. She opened the book. The instruction sheet came across again. The elderly woman felt so helpless that tears just started to accumulate. She used to be so active, so cheerful, but now she sometimes forgot how to turn on the stove or where it was. There were days when Betty would wake up in her bedroom with fear, realizing she wasn't in her own home. Lately, she was thinking more and more about asking her son to go to a nursing home. Soon she wouldn't even remember her own kindred person by sight. Then what was the point of living among people? It was better to be near the medical staff, who would always remember her, help her in case of anything. A motor whirred outside. Betty glanced in the mirror, smiled at herself, and then stepped out onto the porch. Holding on to the railing, the older woman walked down the path toward the low gate. The man who stood by the car was smiling. She looked closely at his face, but couldn't remember. "Mom, I'm your son." Your son. Look at the pictures together," he said, carefully holding out the picture to her. "Of course, Sonny. I'm not forgetting you," said Betty. But she had forgotten him. And every time the elderly woman thought about it, and she got scared. She was losing the last shreds of her memory, remembering with even more difficulty. "What's up? How are you doing? I see you cleaned up the yard. I told you I'd come and clean it up myself. You shouldn't have done that. You should take care of your heart and joints." With care in his voice, Michael said, "Oh, son, Michael, I didn't do anything. I took some eggs to the neighbor. I asked him to clean up a few bundles of greens. He took it all to me. But look how beautiful it is," said the old woman. She spread her hands. Betty would never admit to her son that she didn't like this house and yard. She would rather stay in that abandoned village than try to accept her loneliness here. She wished frantically that some of her family would stay by her side. But that was no longer possible. And Betty's greatest fear was that one day she would not be able to remember her own son, would not let him on her doorstep, would die alone. They entered the house, where everything was fine, even though the disease had taken away not only her memory, but her strength as well. Betty tried to keep the house clean. She was afraid of waking up one day to see that she was living as if in a stable. Her son was glad that his mother continued to be herself, but he tried not to notice how lonely she was here, despite how many people were around. "Mom, I came to talk to you." "Why don't I hire a nurse for you?" he asked. "Why do I need a stranger here?" Betty asked in astonishment. "No, Sonny, I don't need strangers here. It's a pity you have a lot of work. You should come here more often. I miss you, Michael. Oh, I miss you so much," she said with her head down. "Mom, I have to go to another country for a few months. A complicated, long business trip. And I wanted to tell you something about you. Anyway, as soon as I come from the business trip, I'll make you happy," said Michael. You could literally see on his face that he was getting off the subject. But Betty tried not to notice it. After all, she had a grown son who was entitled to his secrets. She forgot his name again. The older woman looked at the man, and the man smiled. "Son, how long are you traveling for?" she asked. "A couple months. And you're sure you can manage on your own? If you realize you can't handle it, call me right away. I'll leave you a note by the phone so you'll remember to call me anytime, and I'll send someone right away." "Okay," he said with a smile. Michael would not tell his mother that he was leaving also because he was terribly tired of her. Catastrophically tired of watching his mother fade before his eyes. He couldn't see her struggling to remember his face, and struggling even harder to remember his name. He wondered if she remembered that he wasn't an only child. Michael shook his head negatively as if he was having an internal dialogue. "Big girl. Can handle it, sure," the older woman said. And then she laughed. "Mom, do you really, if anything, call me? I hope I can get through this faster. I've got my career in full swing. You can't stop now." "No offense," Michael said. "Oh, son, don't worry. I was young once too. I wanted to live. It's awful. Don't worry about me, live and be happy. I'll be fine. You'll see," she said. The old woman smiled, patted her son on the shoulder. The name never came to her mind. Betty sadly noticed that she was getting worse. But she wouldn't tell her son about it, so he wouldn't worry, so he wouldn't cancel his plans for her. A few hours later, they were already standing in the yard. Betty was holding a bowl of pie she had made for her son. He took them to hug them goodbye, saying some amazing words to her. Michael got into the automobile. His mother, who was standing near the fence, waved him off. He would drive away, and perhaps in an hour the elderly woman would not remember him. Michael felt a prick of conscience, some unpleasant inner agitation. He had a strong feeling that he was abandoning his mother in a difficult situation. But he had been trying for so many years to get her out, to help her, that he had almost no strength left. There was a struggle going on inside Michael. On the one hand, he wanted to give his mother to a nursing home, where she would be under constant supervision. On the other hand, at the mere thought he felt guilty, as if he were abandoning her to her fate, depriving her of the last bit of normal life. The village itself was already behind him. He drove towards the airport, replayed in his head the situations that had happened recently, and became afraid of the thought that he would arrive one day, and he would be met by a completely alien look of the woman who was actually his mother. Michael left the car at home, gave the keys to a friend. He took a cab to the airport, where his girlfriend was already waiting for him. When he left, the world would slow down for a while, and all worries would cease to have power over him. Right now, he needed a distraction. His mother wasn't going anywhere. The bus pulled up to a large village. When it stopped, Kelly was sound asleep. She jumped up when someone touched her shoulder lightly. The girl got off the bus in a friendly manner, waving to the passengers who were watching her tiredly, glad apparently that her trip had come to an end, and they still had a long drag to get to their destination. Kelly took a deep breath, crouched down a few times, because her legs stiffened horribly. The old man who sat at the bus stop looked at her carefully. All the locals roughly knew each other, and any outsiders were suspicious. "Excuse me, could you tell me where Betty lives around here?" Kelly asked. The old man looked up thoughtfully, with a nodding lip. Apparently he was trying to remember, but only shook his head negatively. His eyes brightened in a flash. "And how is it that right down this street, right there, the house will be blue, you can't miss it? Right from that house. To the right is a white openwork fence, and behind it is a light-colored two-story house. That's where she lives. And who are you?" asked the old man. "Daughter, my brother, and I have a difficult relationship. You know, family. He moved my mother. He didn't even tell me. So I've been looking for her. How did you know she was getting worse? So I thought I'd come down. Live with her," Kelly said, with a smile. "You're so smart. It's really hard for your mom to forget things on the go. Sometimes she can't even remember how to get home from the store. It's good that she came to live, not just to visit for a couple hours, like your brother. Women have a kinder heart than we men," the old man said. Kelly smiled. She followed the route, but she was a little confused. She seemed to find the blue house too. All the fences turned out to be similar to each other, and the houses themselves were typical. It was immediately noticeable that the village was modern and old, where the shabby huts could not be called houses. The girl, to suggest something, asked a short, full-figured, lovely woman, "I'm still very pretty. I was told to turn from here, but I'm confused. I'm the daughter. I can't find her." "So unfamiliar," Kelly said. "Oh, there's her house," the woman said with a smile, pointing to the house with her palm. "Thank you so much," Kelly said with a smile. As she walked up to the fence, she began to pull an envelope out of her bag. The envelope fit a little, but she tried to straighten it out. "Can I help you?" Betty asked when she saw the girl at the gate. The old woman was embarrassed every time someone came to see her. Maybe it was a relative. Maybe it was an old friend she couldn't remember. "Mom, it's me. Look." She held out a picture of Betty, Michael, and Kelly all together. "God, I got here so late. I didn't even know you'd gotten worse." Michael wouldn't tell me anything. He kept saying everything was fine. "Mommy, I'm so sorry." The old woman stared at her with an absent look. Apparently, she was trying to remember. And then her eyes filled with tears. "Oh, my daughter, I forgot you." With bitterness in her voice, said Betty. Neighbors came out of their houses, watching the story. Some even shed a tear, imagining how old age might affect each of them. "Mommy, don't worry. I came to live with you. Everything will be fine. Don't worry. Now we'll help together. I'll get started. You can't get rid of me now," said Kelly and laughed. As soon as the old woman heard that she would no longer live alone, she shook inside. She cried even more, unable to hold back her emotions. Betty felt some treacherous feeling inside that tormented her, as if she was forcing herself to remember her own daughter. They entered the neighbor's house and gradually dispersed and went about their business. Betty sat at the table and Kelly clapped at the stove. She was frying pancakes and deftly flipping them with one hand. The girl clearly looked happy. Betty looked at her, but struggled to remember any interactions. But could she rely on her own memory now? The older woman looked sadly at her daughter. "And Michael, when was the last time, Mom?" "By God, they should have put devils on him. Why does he come so rarely?" Kelly asked, exasperated. Betty ran her eyes over the pictures. She couldn't remember who Michael was. And the son. The older woman remarked aloud. "So he's away on a business trip. As far as I don't know, I can't remember it, but he left me a note by the phone. Can you look at it?" "All right, later, Mom, later. In the meantime, let's eat with you." "Do you have any jam?" Kelly asked. "Yeah, in the basement. Get your favorite cherry," said Betty. She had no idea. Why did she suddenly remember cherry? The old woman smiled. Already she knew and enjoyed the fact that she was no longer sitting here alone. No more quiet evenings in an empty house. No more trying to remember the loved ones who had left her here. "Where will you be?" "Oh yes," Betty said, remembering that the guest room was always empty. "Mom, don't worry." "Okay, that's it, we'll live together. After all, you can't remember everything in the world and keep it in your head. Really, if you forget something, even my name, if you forget it, just tell me, I'll remind you, and I won't be ashamed. It's not your fault." Kelly persisted. They chatted merrily. Kelly reminisced about her childhood. Betty only recorded those memories as her own. It was as if her daughter was helping her to rebuild her past life. For the first time in a long time, the older woman fell asleep without tears. She knew she would wake up tomorrow. She would read the leaf and then go about her business as usual. But her soul was warmed by the thought that her daughter was with her now. She wouldn't be gone in a day. In a week she would be there for her. Betty fell asleep with a warm sense of security, with love in her soul. Kelly woke up, listening to her surroundings. Everything around her seemed to be asleep. The girl slowly got out of bed, walked over to the older woman's bedroom, but she was asleep. Kelly went downstairs, took a pair of scissors, threw over the counter, and cut the telephone wire. She took off the note that was on the phone there and put it in her pocket. The girl walked all over the first floor, taking the albums, hiding them. Taking a few pictures out of the frames, she also hid them and put them in her pocket. Kelly did her best to make sure that nothing else in this house reminded her of Michael. The only thing that mattered now was to make Betty feel safe. When all the work was done, Kelly went out onto the porch. She lit a cigarette, leaning back. The tall wooden post that supported the roof of the porch. Kelly looked at the clock. It would soon be dawn. Tomorrow she would be a model daughter again. In the meantime, it was okay to just stand there, smoke. Don't worry about the woman's reaction. Sooner or later, Betty would find out she was smoking anyway. But for now, you had to keep up the good work. The girl put out her cigarette, went up to the bedroom, and dozed off again. The next time she woke up, there was the pleasant aroma of apple pillows coming from somewhere downstairs. As she went downstairs, rubbing her eyes, Betty looked at the girl carefully, then nodded as if to show that she remembered her. Come on, daughter, sit down. We had breakfast together. Will you tell me why you came to your mother? And don't lie. Young girls don't just go back to the village, Betty said. Contrary to Kelly's doubts, the old woman didn't notice anything, neither the missing photos, nor the missing albums, nor even the fact that the usual notes were gone. Kelly laid out new notes in her own handwriting. She also put a photo on the table next to her mother's bed. And in that photo, she was already alone. Betty's mom divorced her, Kelly said. I know. You're going to say it's a shame, that I should have kept the family together. But I'm tired. I'm exhausted. Oh, come on, it's not a shame. I'm not the same person I used to be. I'm sorry, my daughter, if I said any nasty things to you. I don't remember now, Betty said. What's so terrible? I'm sick of his drinking. Remember how Dad used to drink? I promised you till the grave that I'd never choose a man like that. What did Mom end up doing? She ended up marrying a drunk? I had no idea it was that bad. He drank, beat me, kept asking me to have a baby. And I ran away. I filed for divorce as soon as I got the divorce papers. Ran to you, she said. Kelly deliberately didn't mention Michael. She wanted to see if her mother would remember for a moment that Kelly had a brother who could help her. But the older woman only shook her head negatively. Sympathizing with her daughter, she gave her advice, repeating that Kelly had done the right thing. Daughter, you're wasting your life here with me. Do you really want to stay? Asked the old woman. I want to spend time with my mom. There's no life to lose. It's great. You smell so good here. It's got its own atmosphere. Don't worry, we'll be fine, Kelly said. The next day, they had a pretty normal schedule. The days went by. Gradually, they built up their own schedule. The old woman was so used to not living alone that even her memories did not include tear-filled evenings. They had dinner together, cooked, looked after the household, where she cleverly reminded her mother, discreetly prompting her what her name was, who she was, and what kind of life the old woman had led before the bony fingers of disease touched her. Quietly, Betty wept, but already she was partly crying. That her daughter lived with her, and that in this life together the old woman did not even remember her ailment. One day they were gardening. Kelly was pruning shrubs, and the older woman was giving her advice on what to do next. The neighbor who was having her bouquet cut came to them. Here, Betty cut you some, she said with a smile. Thank you very much. We'll put you a point. We'll be happy, the older woman said. Michael, when is he coming? Asked the neighbor, where she splashed out abruptly, looked in their direction. She hadn't foreseen that the neighbors might disturb her perfect picture. Now Betty stood and looked intently at the neighbor. Michael who? Betty wondered. Your son, said the neighbor. I don't have any son. The older woman said insistently and thanked her again for the flowers. Mommy, you go inside and I'll talk to Adriana, Kelly said. And you could hear the trembling in her voice. The old woman nodded a third time, thanking her for the flowers, and left. Adriana looked at Kelly carefully, then at the closed door. She couldn't figure out what was going on. They were having a big fight. I've tried to make it up to her, but it just makes it worse for the mother. She's having a heart attack. Michael wants to put her in a nursing home. She's screaming that he wants to get rid of her, that she doesn't have a son. Please don't remind her of that, because her heart's not made of iron, Kelly said thoughtfully. What a bunch of men. But they just want the responsibility off their backs. Okay, I hear you. You're good to stay with your mom. Who knows what's going to happen to her if she's out here all alone? Did you talk to the doctor? Michael says he gave your mother a tiny sentence. Heaps saying she won't make it through the winter, the neighbor said to muffle her own voice. Yeah, I saw the papers. That's actually why I came to stay. I don't want her to be alone for 3 months, Kelly said. An old woman watched the conversation from the window. What son? What made the neighbor think she had a son? The old woman looked around, but the pictures showed her with either strangers or her daughter. Betty remembered for some reason that she had lived here recently. The neighbor must have just gotten confused. When Kelly entered the house, she had a wary look on her face. Betty looked at her daughter and immediately smiled. Oh, Mom, don't worry, it's just a mix-up. You're new here, and everyone knows each other. Don't worry. We just talked it over with her. She remembered that she mistook you for the aunt who lived here before. Kelly literally came up with it on the fly. The old woman was perfectly happy with that answer. But her health began to fail before her eyes. After a couple of days, Betty fell ill, and then she refused to eat or drink at all. Adriana, I woke up to a loud banging on the door. She was trying to wipe her eyes. Went out into the hallway and swung the door open. Saw a frightened Kelly. The girl had huge eyes, pale skin, and an easy-to-read mask of fright. Aunt Adriana, call an ambulance. The mother's cell phone's not working for some reason. My cell phone's out of range. It's bad and she's suffocating. Heart palpitations, Kelly blurted out. Adriana woke up and in a second she was up from her seat, running to the phone. Then the older woman had already called an ambulance. Kelly was out of sight. Already the ambulance pulled up to the house. The doctor came in. He knew the patient's diagnosis. He had to reacquaint himself with her. Despite the fact that it was the 10th time she had been reacquainted, she flatly refused to go, Kelly said. Shaking her head negatively, the doctor had already relieved the patient's condition. Now he went down to the first floor with his daughter. Such a disease. And age too. It's not surprising. You can go and get the medicine. I'll leave you the prescription. But you don't get your hopes up, the doctor said. Kelly handed him the papers and he read them carefully, but shook his head no. You can't even expect her to make it through the winter. If she even lived for a month. Thanks for that, as they say. It's a tough case. Honestly, with these abnormalities, she should have been in the ground a long time ago. Thank God she's been with you this long, the doctor said. Kelly walked out onto the porch with him and then escorted him to the ambulance. The doctor looked worried. I'm afraid it's my fault. She had a big fight with someone. And I reminded her of that person. What if her heart fluttered because of it? Kelly asked. The doctor looked her in the eye, and she somehow calmed it down when she looked back. Despite what had happened, the man remained calm, composed. Don't worry with such an affliction. It's not your fault. Just stay with her a little longer. And change your SIM card so you can call her immediately, the doctor said. Kelly nodded. The ambulance drove away, leaving her alone. The girl stared after the departing car, hugging herself with both arms. She hadn't counted on the elderly woman getting sick so soon. She had an entirely different plan. Kelly returned to her mother's bed, already sound asleep after the medicine. The girl leaned her palm against her forehead. Her skin was clammy and cold from sweat. Kelly sat by the bed for several hours. She didn't notice herself dozing off in the chair. When she woke up, Betty was trying to get out of bed. Mommy's doctor said you need to lie down, Kelly said. Who are you? Oh my God, my daughter, I'm sorry, said the older woman. It was evident with what anguish she remembered her daughter, and now she was back on the bed, where she helped to change the bedclothes, put the mother down again, changed her into a clean shirt. The older woman had absolutely no strength. Call Ethan. We need to talk, she said. Kelly nodded. She went downstairs. She found Ethan's number on the note. When she called him and outlined the situation, the man promised to be there within a few hours. Not quite noon, a dark, low new car pulled up outside the house. Out of it stepped an elderly, stately man who clearly did not want to admit his age. Well, Betty, it's good of you to call, Ethan said. Mom, you asked me to call him, said you had business with him. Remember? Kelly asked insistently. She turned to the man. I'm sorry, she was sick tonight. An ambulance was called. The man nodded. Daughter, I need you to pick up some papers down there in the closet. I wrote a letter the other day, but I can't get up anymore, Betty said with sadness in her voice. Kelly brought in the papers. They had a dry conversation. Betty's entire will have been drawn up in advance, apparently a few days before she'd gotten worse. The old woman had described all her assets and savings to her daughter's only child. Daughter, what's her name? Asked the man. Kathy said the girl who had previously introduced herself as Kelly. Betty nodded. She was having trouble remembering what had happened half an hour ago, and certainly couldn't remember her daughter's name. Kathy realized that her mother would never remember it in just a couple of hours, so as soon as Ethan left, she would be Kelly again. So as not to scare the neighbors or confuse them, Ethan went downstairs with Kelly. The girl nodded at everything he said. He was giving her warnings. Now they had already reached the car. A déjà vu formed in the girl's mind. Not long ago, she was standing next to an ambulance. Now this notary. I think it's time you took care of the funeral arrangements. It's not cheap these days. And you know, it takes time. Your mother doesn't seem to have time. I'm sorry. I've been in this business a long time. But sorry every time, he said. It's strange that she disinherited her son. She wanted revenge. Apparently, he wanted to put her in a nursing home. You know, older people are very vindictive, especially if the people closest to them want to leave them alone or dump them in some place where no one will want them, Kelly said. Ethan nodded, said goodbye to her, then got into the car. Kelly stood for a few minutes, then did all the chores in the yard. She cleaned up the grass that had been mowed yesterday, checked the greenhouses. Except that the shrubs they'd planted the other day suddenly started to wither. It had been a few days. Kelly woke up in the morning and for the first time in a long time did not feel any sounds. Whereas before she had awakened to the aroma of food, after the worsening of her illness she could hear mumbling. The elderly woman was reading, a little audibly out loud. To herself, she was very poor at assimilating information. Now in this lying position, she had only one joy left. Books. Kelly showered, changed her clothes, and entered Betty's bedroom. The woman was still asleep. Mom, it's late to wake up. I must have turned off the alarm clock. Let's get some medicine, Kelly said. But when she got to her mother, she was stunned. She wasn't breathing. Kelly sobbed. She screamed, and apparently through the open window, the neighbor heard everything. Adriana came running to their rescue. And when she saw the whole scene, her heart sank. She took Kelly out of the room, took her downstairs, and made her wash up. You be quiet. Come on, everybody already knew she was gonna die soon. What are you getting so excited about? That's the way you act before you have a heart attack, the woman said. Kelly gradually began to calm down. It was hard to accept the fact that she was going to live here for 6 months, and ended up staying only a month and a half, maybe even a little less. You're good for coming, right? Now imagine if she'd been all alone, dying. Or worse, couldn't even call an ambulance that day. Think about how happy she was these last weeks, that she didn't spend them alone. To hell with her son. He'd left her and moved away. The neighbor read, trying to be supportive of Kelly. She only nodded. Slowly, she came to her senses. She had to pull herself together pretty quickly, because all the things had to be taken care of in a short period of time. Kelly knew where the money was. She counted it for a rainy day, called a special service, talked everything over, and signed the papers. The date for the funeral was set. Everything else would be done without her involvement. Kelly decided not to have a wake in the classic sense of the word. Her mother hardly remembered anyone. Therefore, there were few people here who socialized with her. The girl gathered baskets of food, distributed them among the neighbors, and at the same time those who came several times to check on the old woman during these days. But even though there was no wake, a decent number of people had gathered for the funeral. They all stood slumped in their heads, watching the coffin being lowered. After a couple hours, there was no one left but Kelly. She was still standing by the cross, looking at the small picture of the elderly woman where she was smiling. Kelly went back into the house, began to pack her things. Someone had come to pick her up. Adriana, who was chatting with the girl, went to the fence most of all to exchange a few phrases. But seeing how busy Kelly was, she went inside. Are you leaving? Adriana asked. I thought you were going to stay here for good, or are you just taking the pain of losing your mother? I'm selling. I inherited the house, and I'm selling it, she said. I know it must be hard to be in a place where your mother was all alone. But you know, I wouldn't sell a house if I were you. Just move somewhere else. Then fix it up. It's such a great place, she said with a smile. Where did she suddenly find out? Looked at Adriana. And why did this woman suddenly think she could give her any advice? The girl was still standing, as if trying to find the words, but there was no strength. I told you I'm leaving. So I'll leave, Kelly said calmly. Not half an hour later, she loaded her suitcases into the car, closed the house, and then got into the car and drove away. The neighbors were whispering. Apparently, they had their own gossip about it. Adriana. I looked longingly at the house where the friendly old lady used to live, and now who knows who is going to move in. She took one last look at the car lurking in the distance, and then went off to her room. Kelly sat in the passenger seat, thinking back to the funeral and how it had gone too fast, too painful for her. She really had been preparing herself for a longer journey, but fate had decided otherwise. I thought you'd be back later. Don't get me wrong. It's hard to accept death. But on the other hand, you won't have to live in this village anymore. Fresh air, green grass, it's all great. But when you're used to city life with all the comforts of home, I don't know. I feel like the countryside is becoming some kind of prison without communication, the woman behind the wheel said. Kelly was silent. Maybe she didn't want to discuss anything, or maybe she just wanted to be quiet now. After all, everything had gone relatively well. But she knew that there was more to it than that. As soon as Michael returned, the situation would take a more dangerous turn. And it would be a good idea to finish everything before Michael showed up and possibly ruined her life. Aren't you afraid of the consequences? The voice came again and pulled Kathy out of her thoughts. Now it was hard for her to even think of herself in her familiar name, as if she had not just pretended to be Kelly during this time, but had been her. I know it's going to be hard and probably a lot worse than I realize, but I've already committed to it. There's no turning back, and there's no reason to, she said. But the important thing is to make sure everything goes smoothly, especially since he missed you so much. Yesterday, he even cried that he hadn't seen you for a long time, said the woman behind the wheel. I do everything for him. You know that very well. I hope everything goes well. Then I don't know, I'll probably be thanking all the possible gods on my knees, Kathy said. Everything's gonna be okay. I'm sure that fate must come down on you at some point. After all, it's long overdue, the woman said. The car had long since left the neighborhood where it had been in the village. Both women changed the topic of conversation. Now they were talking about something mundane. Neither of them recalled the funeral or Betty. Not all the machinations Kathy had dared to engage in, taking advantage of the situation. Kathy remembered her son's face, imagined how all the torment would end in one fell swoop. If she were offered the chance to go through it all again, to save her son, she would do it. Michael was sitting on the airplane with his fiancée, and she was holding his hand, but very weakly. The man knew that she had dozed off almost immediately after takeoff, but he hadn't been able to sleep. He was literally being eaten alive by guilt. He'd abandoned his mother, lied to her about the business trip, just so he could spend time alone with his fiancée. He planned to be there in a couple months to introduce his mother to his lover. Now the only thing he had to do was go to the cemetery. And who was in charge of the funeral then? He didn't want to think about it. He'd gotten a call to let him know. A condolence call, and that was it. How much longer? Christina asked. She opened her eyes a little. Her face showed signs of fatigue. So many hours of flying. Anyone would be tired here. Christina stood up in her seat, adjusted her seatbelt, which she would never unbuckle. For the entire flight, she pulled a crumpled lollipop out of her purse, popped it in her mouth to stop the nausea. Landing in 200, he said, and she nodded. Didn't feel like discussing anything right now. She leaned back in her chair, looked at her future husband. It did not escape Christina's eyes that Michael looked depressed. She was aware of the situation, but she didn't understand why he should be so upset about it. The man knew his mother was seriously ill. He knew it could happen in his absence, but somehow he still felt guilty. You need to calm down. You can't spend the rest of your life blaming yourself, she asked me. I left her, you don't understand. She was out there dying alone while I was grilling you on the beach. I knew it was dangerous to leave her. I feel like a traitor, Michael said. Christina shrugged. She pulled the blindfold over her eyes, which had just been on her forehead the whole time. Michael was not surprised by her detachment. Christina had always been less emotional than he was. He loved her, was willing to marry anything to make her happy. This whole situation had significantly undermined their relationship. Michael began to snap at his fiancée, barely restrained emotions. But even he understood perfectly well that in him speaks guilt. It's not your fault, Michael. Your mother was gravely ill. She died. It happens. Especially since you knew the doctor's prognosis was overly optimistic. She didn't even remember you before she died. There's no point in worrying, Christina said. Michael got up, walked along the cabin of the plane, went into the restroom. He stood there for about 10 minutes to calm down and only came out when the knocking started. Michael felt defeated. No support, not even from his fiancée. For the first time, Christina's coldness had hurt him so much. How could he not think about his mother's death? How could he not think about leaving her alone while he sunbathed and enjoyed his vacation? When he returned, Christina didn't say a word to him. Apparently, she was dozing off again, or maybe she was pretending not to talk to him about anything. After landing, everything was standard. Michael picked up the suitcase. They left for the car that was already waiting for them. After a couple hours or so, they were at the apartment. The first thing the girl did was head to the shower to clean herself up. When she came out almost an hour later, she looked clearly better than she had on the airplane. The man followed her example. When he got out of the shower, Christina was arranging food from containers. Only at dinner time. Both of them realized how hungry they were. Christina never ate on an airplane, and certainly not before the flight. She gets carsick a lot. Such were her methods of caution. Michael didn't eat because he was very anxious. It was impossible to get even a handful of food down. Listen, let's go to the cemetery tomorrow. You apologize to your mother and calm down. I don't want to see your tired and upset face all the time. I understand you're upset. But I also want to have a husband by my side, not a personally sad boy, Christina said. He nodded. He didn't argue with her. Maybe Christina was right. It was time to pull himself out of this state. Early the next morning, the man was already behind the wheel. Christina immediately declined, citing that she had jet lag. After how long they had been at the airport before their flight, how long the flight had been delayed, she was understandable. Michael had expected her to travel with him to support him, but she stayed home. As the man drove up to the village, he passed the mother's house. He felt like a traitor, felt some inner emptiness. All the way the man was tormented by a constant sense of guilt, which only grew. Here before him grew unnaturally huge wrought iron gates of the cemetery. They were very old. The rusty gate would probably never close again. The old man, the cemetery caretaker, glanced quickly at Michael, then turned his attention back to the card game he was busy playing. His opponent didn't even look at the newcomer. Michael pulled out a bouquet of flowers, entered the gate. His mother bought her own place in the cemetery, about 6 months before she died. So he knew where to go. Here at last showed a mound of earth, a beautiful carved cross, and a small photograph. There were plenty of fresh flowers. Even though Mother had been dead for over a month. Forgive me if you can, Michael said quietly. He couldn't say another word. A lump rose in his throat, preventing him from crying or saying anything. Somewhere inside, a painful sense of worthlessness was growing. When Michael looked up, he saw a familiar silhouette. He recognized Adriana almost immediately as his mother's roommate. He wanted to close himself off, to fall through the ground and run away. He wanted to do anything to avoid being seen. He didn't want to hear what a disgusting person he was for leaving his mother all alone with such a serious illness. Adriana had already seen him, changed course, headed straight for him. Michael realized that an unpleasant conversation could not be avoided. He went outside the fence to wait for his mother's neighbor. You couldn't tell from her face that Adriana was angry. Her face was rather just sad. "Hello, Michael," she said. Michael nodded. He realized that she was trying to find the words. Of course, anyone would be trying to find words after all that had happened. Adriana looked at him with an unhappy, frustrated look. He only smiled crookedly. The man didn't know what was worth saying now. "I guess I should be saying that you did good. You bought your mother a house. But honestly, I blame you. You left her alone and ran off to work," Adriana said, in an unhappy tone. Michael suddenly thought that her hatred would have been even stronger if she'd found out that he'd gone away not for work, but just to vacation with his future wife. He simply lowered his head so as not to diffuse the conflict. She didn't remember anyone here. Looked at me like a new gate every time, and you left her alone. At least Kelly's here. Thanks for that, Adriana said. Kelly's here? Michael asked. She nodded. The man looked worried. Apparently, he was trying to remember who Kelly was and who might have come to see his mother. Adriana paid no attention to the fact that he looked a little lost. The poor girl had fiddled with her so much. Your mother had gotten so sick in a few days before she died that she went blind. Well, Kelly didn't ask anyone for help. Cooked and cleaned and bathed her. Everything she did to make the old lady comfortable. If it wasn't for her, you'd be a mother. Couldn't even call an ambulance for herself. Did you even know she cut her own phone cord? Adriana asked. Michael looked at his mother's former roommate in amazement. She didn't even look at him. All this time, Adriana was just staring at the grave of her former neighbor. She shook her head negatively. I'm going to have a baby. I wish I hadn't done what you did. How scary is it when you can't remember anything? And you were left alone. Gee, Michael expects karma from his own children, Adriana said. And when did Kelly arrive? Asked Michael, letting the threats pass his ears. The same day you left. You should at least ask her. You probably didn't even leave her any money. It's not for nothing that your mother said she has no son with sons like that. I'd rather not know my father. Adriana decided not to listen to any answers. She turned around and walked towards the familiar grave where she was originally headed. Michael was completely confused, standing there looking at the grave. Not many people her mother remembered from her past. After all, she had plenty of girlfriends. It was odd that his sister's name was Kelly, but it was unlikely that she would have been at his mother's house, much less cared for her. Michael stood for a few more minutes. He apologized to his mother one last time and then walked to the car. He replayed over and over in his head everything that had been said until he was completely confused by the story. One thing was clear, the mother didn't seem to have died alone. It took a long time for the man to leave. It was either guilt or some inner turmoil that prevented him from moving. There was also a strange sense of unspoken. As soon as Michael started the car, the phone rang. Michael picked up the phone and heard the familiar voice of an old friend. Listen, Michael, are you in town? Asked the man, and there was anxiety in his voice. Nearby has already happened. What? Michael was worried. I need you to come up to the office. These things are not discussed over the phone. You know that. It's obviously not a legal thing. Can you come down today? The man asked. I'll be there in an hour and a half, if there's no traffic, Michael said. Now the situation got even weirder. First, some Kelly, then a call from a friend. Everything was connected. Michael turned on the radio so he wouldn't have to think about anything. He hoped the music, the announcers' voices would help distract him. But instead, he kept going over in his head what had happened, and how could it be explained. Michael felt in his gut that the situation was just beginning to gain momentum. The man pulled up outside the law office. He left the car and went up to the right floor. Sebastian shook his hand firmly and in a matter of minutes took him to his office. He took out copies of the papers and handed them to Michael. We can only hope for your honesty. These are copies of your mother's will. Are you aware that she left you with nothing? He asked. Sebastian looked troubled. Michael, who had not yet grasped the situation, ran his eyes over the papers, trying to figure things out for himself. This can't be happening. I don't understand. Where's the name? Who gets everything then? Michael asked. That's the interesting part. I don't know who did it and how they did it. But here's the last copy, all the apartment accounts. The house in the village went to Kathy, Sebastian muttered, holding out another sheet. Michael first blushed, then turned pale. It was obvious that he was completely confused, hardly aware of what was going on. The information was coming at him in an avalanche. He looked up at Sebastian. Sebastian, I have no idea who Kathy is. It's the first time I've ever heard that last name. I'll hold on. There's something fishy going on here. First, my mother's roommate tells me that Kelly was helping her. This is Kathy all over again, said Michael. Sebastian went through the paperwork again, too. But there was no mention of a Kelly, not even close. It was all jumbled up into one endless story. Sebastian took all the papers back and put them in a folder. But after thinking for a couple minutes, he shoved them into his bag. He couldn't let himself get caught red-handed. He'd already broken a lot of laws while he was sneaking copies through the courts. We just digitized the office. Our whole system's changed. I saw your mother's initials, last name, when I saw there was nothing left for you. I realized there was something fishy going on. I thought I'd make copies. If you tell anyone, believe me, not only will I be fired, but I won't even be able to get a job afterwards, Sebastian said in a guilty voice. He realized that his friend might go to the police, but he hoped he was being reasonable. Michael only nodded, staring at one point. Don't worry, I won't go anywhere. I'll have to do some digging. I don't like this whole story at all, Michael muttered. Michael didn't want to back down. He kept everything he'd just heard and seen in his head. He dialed the phone number, erasing it. The man sat there, thinking for a few minutes. He dialed the right phone number after all. Pretty soon, the young woman who answered on the other end of the phone promised to call an old lady. Michael was answered by an old friend of his mother's, who she must have long since forgotten. Hello, Michael. I'm sorry for your loss. It's a great loss to lose your mommy, said the woman, shaking her head negatively. Christina, I have a few questions for you. Can you tell me if Kelly was a friend of yours? I was told that my mother was helped by a Kelly before she died, and now I can't find her to thank her. You see, I went on a business trip to another country. I didn't even know what was going on here, Michael said. The elderly woman thought for a while when her voice broke again. All the man's hopes were dashed. We didn't have any Kelly. Only your sister, as I recall. But that was it. I was surprised at the time. Such a rare name for a girl, the old woman said. Does Kathy or does the name Kathy mean anything to you? Michael insisted. He really wanted to know what was going on after all. It was scary to just be in the dark like this, realizing that his mother had been tricked. Kathy, repeated the older woman. She stopped talking. She was staring at the wall, but Michael couldn't see her. He could only hear her heavy breathing. She was about his mother's age. No wonder her health was failing. Cross my heart, Michael. I don't remember any Kathy. You go to the village itself, ask the neighbors. What are you waiting for? They must know by now. They're all out in the open. It's you city folk who shut yourselves off from each other. In the country, everything's on display. All right, Michael. Tired. I guess I'll go, she said. Michael said goodbye to the old woman. He arrived home, but he still couldn't sleep. Until the morning, the man replayed in his head everything that had happened. He didn't really explain anything to his wife, and he didn't want to worry her unnecessarily. What was the use? Christina would not support him anyway, and there was no sense in having a conversation for nothing. Early in the morning, Michael was already sitting in the car and writing down everything he needed to find out. He needed to figure out who Kathy was. Also, who was Kelly, who showed up, helped his mother, then disappeared. What if his mother had been under the control of some black realtors all along? It was scary to think that once again he hadn't kept her safe. Michael started the car, drove to the village, trying to distract himself with another program on the radio. The car crossed the village road, and finally the typical village houses came into view. Michael, who had already gone over the questions dozens of times in his head, was ready to talk. The man who lived directly across the street from Michael's mother had said something great. Now the cabin looked vital and empty. Even looking at it was eerie. More recently, laughter could be heard from there. Lively conversations, and now the black windows looked eerily across the street. Hello, Uncle. What kind of maiden came to see her mother when she had been bad the last few days? Asked Michael, deciding not to start from afar. So she came, I think, the same day you left. Although, you know, Michael, I probably don't remember most of it myself. I'm on medication. But my memory's suffering. Nice girl. I remember helping your mother, laughing all the time, saying they had a full family now, said the man, shrugging his shoulders. What's going on over there? Asked Lisa, leaving the house. The uncle's wife looked worried. She stepped closer. The man outlined the situation to her. Yes, a nice girl kind. Hair like that, you know, shoulder length. Eyes dark, almost black, skin a little swarthy, pretty, you can tell. I wondered how such a pretty girl got to the village, said Lisa with her hands. She looks like her, Michael asked, realizing that the answer would be no. In the picture, he was next to another dark-haired girl. Oh no, it was different. What's the matter? Did you lose it? You and your sisters are brothers, always losing touch, running away. And then there's no end in sight. You should go to Adriana. They've been talking well. They probably call each other back, said Lisa. Michael nodded and almost immediately turned abruptly and went to the neighboring house. He knocked, and a few minutes later Adriana came out. She was wrapped in a warm robe over Mask's face. Michael frowned. Come in, Michael, do not be afraid. The tooth is being treated. So I put the mask on. The smell of the medicine is creepy. I'm freezing because my teeth hurt. Come in, don't be afraid, she said, pointing to the gazebo. Yeah, I'll just be a couple minutes. I don't have time to sit around much, said Michael. I'm sorry I snapped at you then, said Adriana. Apologizing tone. Oh, come on. I understand perfectly. I blame myself. Can you tell me who Kelly was that looked like? Michael held out the same picture again. No, I don't know this girl at all. Don't you know where to find your own sister? Even though she said you haven't spoken to her in 7 years. You can't do that, Michael. You've got a mother now. No, you've got to stick together. You're on opposite sides of the barricade, Adriana said in that tone of voice. I haven't spoken to my sister in 4 years, but now we call every day. I'm afraid we'll lose each other. Michael looked very carefully at Adriana's face. He apparently couldn't put 2 and 2 together, and his head was filled with white noise. He tried to concentrate on the conversation, but it wasn't working. I had her phone number, but she wasn't answering. I guess she decided to change things up. She packed up after the funeral and left the same day. The house is still standing. Sometimes some people come by, so she must have put it up for sale, Adriana said. Michael thanked her warmly for the phone number and then went back to the car. He turned the car around, leaving dust behind him. Michael tried to call the phone number several times along the way, but nothing worked. Nervousness was starting to push through the upper limits. Just a little more and he would start to get angry. Michael entered the apartment, but did not answer his wife's questions, but went straight to the shower. He stood under the icy jets, already completely out of his mind. Michael, can you explain to me what is going on? Christina insistently spoke, obviously dissatisfied with the fact that she had to literally beg. The circumstances of his dissatisfaction. Let me come to my senses, said Michael, rather rudely. She fell behind him because she knew it was best not to piss him off in that state. She came back to him an hour later when Michael's face had gone from angry to lost. He told her everything that had happened, and that your sister couldn't come to see your mother. It's good that your mother was with someone close to you when she died. You can finally get rid of the guilt. Really? Christina asked. Yes, Christina. The only problem is that my sister Kelly died 10 years ago, Michael summarized. No one would recognize her from the photo. It couldn't have been Kelly. Besides, there was nothing left of her in the coffin either. He threw the mug and it shattered. Christina stood there like a thunderclap, stunned, still trying to comprehend what she'd heard. Some black realtors must have taken advantage of the fact that my mother didn't remember anything, so they made a farce of it. Oh God, I don't know. What if she was sick? She was a month and a half before she died. She thought she had her daughter with her. She didn't even remember that her daughter was long dead. She didn't even remember that it took her so long to die. It just doesn't make sense, Michael said. He threw his head back, bumping painfully against the wall. But that didn't bother him now. He sat there, thinking about what had happened and trying to figure out how to handle the situation. So he'd have to go to the police. Then we'll find out who got everything. Maybe they just rewrote the house. Your mother has several apartments as far as I remember, and all old people have an account where they put money for years. Christina said with a shrug. Apparently she was trying to find something to hold on to. He looked at her with a completely hopeless look. He had thought he would have to settle inheritance issues, sell the apartments, take care of the house. And now it turned out that in all probability he would get nothing at all. And what can the police do? It's a certified document that says in black and white that everything goes to Kathy. So you don't know any of Kathy's family? Christina asked. I remember Kathy, but not Kathy. And what does she care about my mother? How many years has it been? I don't know. We should probably wait for her on the day of the reading of the will, Michael said. They talked for another half hour or so before they changed the subject. Michael had pretty much deflated by now, calmed down. Could talk normally. It was hard, but he tried to keep his cool. For the first time in a long time, he was able to sleep. But in the morning, an interesting idea came into his head. Michael, having secured the support of an old acquaintance, decided to talk to him about what had happened, to find out in advance whether it was worth going to the police. David was waiting for him at the station for an informal conversation. Even though Michael had done nothing wrong, for some reason, being in the police station made him uncomfortable, as if he were here against his will. Look, David, what if Michael started to talk, but a man interrupted him? No, Michael, since you're here, just tell it like it is. No assumptions, David said with a wry grin. The thick scar that crossed his nose was frightening. It marred the once handsome face of Michael's former classmate. Okay, it's just a stupid situation. Anyway, Maria's mother had an illness. She was so sick, she couldn't remember anything after an hour. I'd leave notes all over the house. I always came with a picture of us so she'd have a chance to recognize me. Anyway, I went away on a business trip, came back 2 months later. And my mother was gone, Michael said. And he paused. David momentarily had the smile blown off his face. He handed water to his former classmate and now listened much more attentively. In the will, it is all normal signed, certified. That is not a forgery. It says that everything goes to another person. And I don't know this person. Can I do anything? Michael asked. In theory, you can write a report. An investigation will begin, said David, shrugging his shoulders. But in practice, Michael clarified. And in practice, there's absolutely nothing you can do. Michael, if everything is certified, signed, no one will approve anything for you. Am I right to understand that you have not been with your mother for the last months? Even if they ask the neighbors, they will all confirm that they bequeathed to someone else that you were not around. In these matters, everything is very sharp. Almost nothing can be proved, said David. Michael leaned back in his chair and looked somewhere to the side. His gaze was hard. When he looked at David again, he was focused. He left the office and came back about 10 minutes later. It's not gonna work. Michael, there's no felony. You just didn't get the inheritance. Whoever it was did a very clean job. There was something you could have done if you'd gotten some sort of disability, as if to confirm that your mother couldn't live on her own, David said, gently sidestepping the urgency of the situation. Are you saying I left my mother in a dire situation? Asked Michael grudgingly. The only thing I'm saying is that you have no chance of proving anything. If you want to file a report, call me. But I won't promise anything, said David. Michael left the office in an even more shattered state than he had been before. It was hard to believe that all this would go unpunished. At home, Christina tried to cheer him up, to calm him down. But Michael was in a state where no one could help him. Everything inside of him was boiling all the time. Now and then, Michael went to the balcony, stood there, waiting for him to calm down. He did not want to yell at his future wife, and certainly did not want to ruin relations with her. Because of his temper, he could spend hours in his office, listening to his own thoughts flow. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Michael knew exactly who Kathy was, but the last name didn't add up, and that she would come all the way out here? For what? For home? I don't think it was worth it. She couldn't have calculated in advance that she would arrive and leave before Michael returned. The man didn't just feel cheated. He felt as if he'd been broken into. On the day of the announcement of the will, Michael was already standing outside an hour before the appointed time. He couldn't even sit in the car. Frost, a light rain. There was a real storm on his mind. The man who was to announce and explain everything entered the room. Assistant Michael followed him. I've already called the other side. I understand you'll be alone tonight. I don't know why you're here. I don't know why your mother changed her will and appointed a different trustee for the funeral. 2 apartments in the center of the counting house. Everything went to Kathy. I don't know what you want to know or get from me, in a tired voice, the older man said. I want to know who Kathy is, Michael said insistently. Look, I've got a dozen people like you. You come, you resent me, you argue with me. But I can't do anything about it, you know. All I can do is announce a will that's already been prepared. If you want to deal with her, look for her. She'll probably show up at the house soon to put it up for sale. That's the way it's usually done. The man spoke again in a tired voice, showing no emotion at all. Michael did not even speak to him. He jumped out, but immediately looked at the secretary and stopped. Can I get the phone number mentioned in the will? He asked. The girl shook her head negatively. Michael went outside. He got into the car and immediately grabbed the vibrating cell phone. Michael, it's Aunt Adriana over there. You might have time to talk to her, Adriana said. Thank you so much. You can't imagine how much you're helping me out, Michael said. He had probably never driven so fast to his mother's village before. Michael just flew down the highway, not even afraid of getting a ticket. And now all he wanted was to see the face of the girl or woman who had gotten it all. When the car finally stopped outside the house, when he burst into the house, he was stunned. Standing before him was the very Kathy he had suspected just a few days ago. He couldn't believe it was her. Slimmed down, all grown up. She had a different, grown-up face. Michael thought he was going to scare the girl, but he didn't. Kathy didn't even seem surprised that he was here. So it's you. Since when are you Kathy? He asked. If you remembered anything other than getting up my skirt, you'd know that's my real last name, he said. She was looking at him like a wildcat. It was as if she were ready to pounce on him at any possible second. I don't understand, Michael said. But he didn't have time to finish. Of course you do, Michael. How can you understand? Have you forgotten how you took me against my will? Forget how you played the relationship game. As long as I don't report you. I remember everything, Michael. Kathy screamed. She took a few steps back, and Michael backed away too. He opened his mouth in shock, not knowing what to say for himself. He had grown up, matured, and tried not to remember the situation. Or what? Michael? Don't you remember when I had a baby with you? Or did you forget the baby was born? Kathy continued to scream in pain. Now the puzzle in Michael's head was coming together. One by one, he went through the memories in his head. He simultaneously hated himself and at the same time did not understand why she had decided to do such an immoral act. I didn't do anything wrong. I followed you and realized you didn't care about your mother at all. I thought she only had a house. I had no idea about the apartments or the bank account. I didn't do it all for me. I did it all for him. I'll sell everything, buy him tickets, pay for his surgery and full rehab. My son will be healthy, Kathy said. I'd say our son, but you don't care about him. The man, who was absorbing every word, looked around stupidly. It was as if he was looking for support in the empty house. Only now he noticed that there was almost nothing left that reminded him of his mother. Weren't you ashamed to pretend to be my dead sister? Michael asked. Your mother didn't care. Whether I was her real daughter or not. I cared about her. I was willing to be with her for years, even though I knew about the diagnosis. By the time you came back from vacation, she wouldn't even remember you, wouldn't let you in, and I would have been with her until the end. I didn't ask her to rewrite anything. I was just hoping for a deed of gift on the house, Kathy said. Her voice got a little quieter. Apparently her confidence had faded. Michael raised his hands conciliatorily, as if to show that he was not going to attack her. But Kathy was still holding the long cane-shaped umbrella tightly in her hands. Was she gripping the handle so hard that her knuckles shared? That's not fair. Kathy is my mother, after all. It was all supposed to go to me, he said. And now it's going to a child you don't want. Remember when I told you about my son's diagnosis? Did you tell me you didn't want a handicapped child? It's easy for you to have a healthy baby. I can keep this one. Yes, what I did was completely immoral. But my child will have a life. And I'm willing to go to jail for that, Kathy said. Michael did not know how to justify what he had said in the past. Kathy tried to get around him, but he blocked her exit. She looked as if she was looking for something else to defend herself with. He wanted more explanations from her, something to appeal to. There's nothing you can do, Michael. No court will help you. Every neighbor here will speak in my favor. Maybe I'm not his own daughter. And that before she died, your mom wasn't alone. She was with someone she thought was her own daughter. You should have seen how happy she was here every day," said Kathy. "I'm sure you'll think about it, or I'll go through the courts," said Michael. "You'll persist in taking money from your own son." "Wow, that's interesting. And in court, I'm a fiduciary," said Kathy. She shoved him with her shoulder and sprinted out into the street. Michael wouldn't dare make a scandal in the street. Too much he depended on public opinion. The man stepped out onto the porch and looked around, as if afraid to see the neighbors. "You'll learn a lesson from life. Don't forget, every mouse will be hung by its tail," said Michael. "And I don't care if my baby lives." "Michael, the baby you left behind," said Kathy. She got in the car and wanted to pull forward, but he jumped out in seconds right in front of the car. She pushed him lightly with her bumper and then hit the brake. He came closer, but the girl blocked the door. "Kathy, you tricked her. You tricked me with the law. You think you're going to get away with it. You're wrong if you think you can get away with this," he shouted. But Kathy backed up. Michael, who had rolled onto the car, fell forward and dropped his knees into the dusty road. Kathy turned the car around and then just drove off, leaving him all alone. Michael was still in complete shock and prostration. He was piecing together what had happened in his head and could not justify Kathy, himself, or the behavior of the neighbors who suddenly believed in the existence of his daughter, even though he himself had moved his mother here a short time ago. No one knew that his sister had died long ago. The man got into the car, came to his head to the steering wheel, then looked at the house, near which there was now a sign that read "For Sale." He drove home slowly, barely breaking the speed limit, the allowable threshold. Michael entered the apartment, plopped down on the bed with his clothes on. No explanations or stories. Christina was up to her neck in work. When she was free, Michael was already able to get up and take a shower. But there was no energy to eat. She set the small coffee table in the living room. It was only after that he was able to tell her everything. Christina was shocked that he had a child, and even more shocked that he had abandoned him to his fate. This was the man she was going to marry. "I accused her of having a baby, of running away sick. I lied to her about going on a business trip to earn money for the baby's surgery." Michael was adamant about not calling the baby his son. He must be about 3 years old now. Christina looked at her future husband with all eyes digesting the information and not understanding how he could not have told her about it earlier. "Don't get me wrong. It's not all that simple. I really do realize how wild it looks from the outside," but he started to speak. However, Christina interrupted him. "Leave everything as it is and establish a relationship with the child. After all, you are his father. Consider that God has saved you a kind of forgiveness from above for your Turkish act," she coined. Christina pictured with horror how Kathy had once been left alone with a sick child and a noodle from the man she loved. She imagined how the young girl had fought the system, suffered to get any allowance for the baby. Her throat constricted at the thought that all this time Michael had just been living like nothing had happened. "Do you realize how much money there is out there?" he asked. "What kind of money is there, Michael?" "A little house and 2 tiny apartments in the center. God helped the baby to have enough for the operation. You're still thinking about money after all this? You have no idea how disappointed I am in you," Christina said. That night she packed up, left the apartment, and never returned. They were only able to reconcile a few weeks later, when Christina had already experienced the situation internally. Michael really decided to leave things as they were, but he never wanted to communicate with the child. He didn't want to know that he had a disabled child. Didn't want to suffer watching the baby's life destroyed. He chickened out, to put it simply. Their relationship with Christina changed dramatically. The woman was afraid that when she gave birth and the baby was unwell, and Michael was out of the picture. No, he convinced her that things would be very different. But as they say, statistics don't lie. Christina got in touch, found Kathy, and talked to her about everything that had happened. It turned out that the money from the sale of the apartment and the house was just enough for the surgery, the rehab, and a little vacation she had planned for a year from now, when everything would be behind her. What she said. Will she file for alimony? Michael asked. When Christina's conversation ended, Christina looked with pity at the man who now caused her only disgust. And how could she have loved him? It was sickening to think of letting him go to her, of accepting his offer. His son was about to undergo the heaviest surgery in another country, a long rehabilitation. All he cared about was whether he'd have alimony. The surgery was a success. The kid recovered very quickly. Quality rehabilitation helped him gradually return to normal life. By the age of 4, the little boy already looked like a quite healthy child. Of course, by that time, Kathy managed to earn money, but already on his small business. So they had enough for a vacation. She could not be happy that she got such a chance in life. Michael and Christina separated because the woman could not look at her failed husband with other eyes after the situation. Michael has found a new partner and has already made sure that she does not know anything about his past.
Subscribe and click the bell.
Betty looked out of the cab window at the cityscapes running by and smiled. She was on her way home from the airport, her business trip unexpectedly postponed. The chief had called her boss, with whom Betty was already preparing to go through passport control, and informed her that there was no need to fly anywhere today. "Let's go home," Clara, the chief accountant of their company, ordered. "Today we rest. Tomorrow I'll see you at the office." Betty couldn't believe her sudden good fortune. A whole free day and Mason, just at home, took a vacation for a week, and daughter Molly flew with her parents to Miami. Finally, she and her husband would have some alone time. They needed it so badly. After all, lately both of them catastrophically do not have enough time for each other. But before it was different. Compliments, admiring glances, walks, romantic acts, surprises without reason, and talk about everything in the world. When did it change? With the birth of her daughter, or with Betty's going to work after a prolonged maternity leave? The woman couldn't remember the exact moment when Mason began to drift apart. It seemed to have been going on for about 3 years. Betty missed her spouse's jokes, attention, and care. She sincerely missed her formerly loving husband. The mere sight of him made a woman feel loved and attracted. Of course, Betty understood. Mason has a serious job. He often has to fly to Boston, where their company opened a large branch 4 years ago. He practically lives there, sometimes staying for weeks at a time, tired. It's understandable that he doesn't have time for romance. No, Mason honestly fulfilled all the duties of a husband and father, provided their family with everything they needed, spent his free time with his daughter, never gave up household chores. Yet Betty realized it was time for a change. She wanted that warmth back. This free day to spend alone with her husband was just the right thing to do. It would be good for their relationship, as if fate itself were helping them. Betty quietly opened the door with her key. She wanted the effect of surprise, to see her husband's surprised and delighted face. She tiptoed into the hallway. From their bedroom came Mason's quiet voice. He was on the phone, probably being disturbed from work again. He often received calls and texts, even at night, and on weekends or holidays, he could easily be called to the office or to the site. What can you do? He was an important person in a large construction company. But the paycheck was right. Betty was not the kind of wife who threw tantrums at her busy husband, demanding attention. She understood that her husband was trying for the sake of their family, even felt sorry for him, and was grateful to him for this work, and was proud of such a busy and irreplaceable husband. And now the woman did not interfere with Mason, lurked at the front door and decided to let him finish his conversation and then discover his arrival. But her husband's tone was strange, clearly non-businesslike. Betty involuntarily listened to the words. "Sweetheart, but I'll make a deal. They'll give you a few days of rest, come." Why would I pass up a chance like that? "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything. I'll buy you tickets, of course, but when else will it happen that my wife will go on a business trip for a week? She rarely goes on business trips, and then there's my daughter at the sea. Jenna, you wanted to see the Capitol. I'll give you a tour." Betty couldn't believe her ears. Is this really happening to her? Her husband is now cooing with some lady and even calling her over to their place while his wife is away on business. Mason has a mistress. Betty really wanted to explain the overheard conversation to herself in a different way, but her imagination was clearly lacking for a different version. And what else could she do to justify all this? Sunshine. "Come here. My wife's on a business trip." Mason almost cooed into the phone, speaking tenderly and affectionately. He hasn't spoken to his wife like that in a long time. Apparently, the unfamiliar Jenna had decided to come to New York after all. That's great. Mason was sincerely happy. "I'll meet you at the airport. I have such plans. We'll have a great time." Yeah, whatever you want." "Oh, you're so beautiful. I'm looking forward to it, too." The conversation seemed to be coming to an end. Betty crept back to the door on shaky legs and slipped out onto the landing. She decided not to show Mason that she had heard him on the phone with someone named Jenna, a beauty by the looks of it. At least that's what he'd called her. Yes, Betty had no doubts about the superior looks of Mason's date. Her husband had always been an aesthete. The woman entered the apartment a second time. Now she purposely slammed the door loudly, signaling her presence. Mason stepped out into the hallway. Betty watched carefully as the confusion, surprise, and disappointment in his eyes was gradually replaced by amazed joy. Her husband had always been excellent at self-control. Now he quickly pulled himself together. If Betty had not heard this conversation, she would not have noticed that her arrival was not a happy news for her husband. "You're back," he smiled broadly. Mason was good at hiding his frustration at the lurking plans. "What kind of actor?" "Rescheduled a business trip," Betty replied. Her heart was pounding furiously, and her head was starting to hurt. "Were you upset about it?" Mason asked. "You're just not wearing your face. I felt sick in the cab." Betty lied. "I want to lie down." She went to the bedroom and, without undressing, fell in their big bed, trying not to think about the fact that perhaps her husband was planning to invite his mistress here. How could this be? They had been through so much together, had traveled so long and hard to build their prosperous, happy family, and had overcome all the difficulties together, shoulder to shoulder, always supporting each other, so many small and big victories behind them. Periodically, Betty would learn that the husband of one of her colleagues or friends had a mistress. Outraged and certain that it would definitely never happen in her family. And now this conversation. Her head ached, growing increasingly nauseous. Mason, seeing his wife lying pale and in a state of flux, was alarmed and brought her painkillers and a cold compressed to her forehead. Had it not been for the overheard conversation, Betty would now be glad of such care. But then she wouldn't have been sick, either, because she'd been overexcited and her blood pressure had skyrocketed. Pressing her fingers to her temples so that the headache was easier to bear, Betty thought back to her and Mason's acquaintance. It had been a fun, carefree college time. The girl was relaxing in a club, in the company of classmates. There she had been noticed by him, a charming fellow with a wide, white-toothed smile, witty and cheerful, who could dance, unlike Betty herself. "What a handsome boy," Kelly remarked, a childhood friend. "Lucky you, don't miss out." And Betty? Yes, Mason was a prince, but right now she just wanted to have fun with her friends. She had no plans for romance, much less a serious relationship. Only recently Betty had hardly got rid of her ex-boyfriend, obsessive and constantly demanding attention. And now the girl was enjoying her freedom. The admiration in Mason's eyes was pleasing to Betty's ego. She liked his compliments and touches. He obviously hoped to continue communication outside the club, even took Betty's phone number. However, she had changed some numbers on purpose, as she often did. The girl did not plan a second meeting, so she tried to enjoy communication with a handsome guy here and now. And then their student company decided to go to another club, closer to the house where Betty lived. The girl said goodbye to her new acquaintance, who was upset by this news. Mason then gently took her narrow palm in his, kissed her hand gallantly, and said, "I'll call you back. I really liked you. You're so beautiful, so special. I won't let you go." Betty smiled. She felt like a real princess at that moment. The girl was always popular with the opposite sex. She had what is called a model appearance. Tall, slender, long-legged, her shiny brown hair falling below her shoulders, and emerald green eyes, regularly received admiring glances and compliments, and each time it was very gratifying. As she did now, Betty smiled sweetly at Mason, whom she thought she would never meet again. And she got into the overcrowded car of her classmates, where her friends were already waiting for her. The merry company drove through the night streets of her hometown for a long time. The students laughed, sang their favorite songs, made plans for the approaching summer, and Betty, to her surprise, couldn't stop thinking about Mason. It wasn't the first time she'd given a guy the wrong phone number, only now she regretted it for some reason. And she felt guilty about lying to her new acquaintance. The first person Betty saw when they pulled up to the club was Mason. It turned out he had taken a cab and followed their car and was now walking toward her smiling and open arms. The girl hurried toward the guy with joy and relief. How lucky was it that he had guessed to do this? She was afraid they would never meet again. With Mason, Betty had always been fun. He knew exactly how to cheer her up and make her laugh. Next to him, she felt safe from everything in the world and very loved. She realized that if she needed him, Mason would do everything possible and impossible for her. And it was very pleasant. And Mason had somehow gained authority among Betty's friends, which was very important to her. And this could not but make the girl proud of her for such a witty and communicative young man. He, like Betty, was a student, a third-year student, but he was studying at another university, an architectural and construction university, and was already working part-time for a friend of his father's. Betty, on the other hand, was fully immersed in her studies. Her parents offered her to enter the University of Economics to study accounting. The girl didn't mind. By the end of the 11th grade, she had no special preferences. An accountant, so an accountant. Vacancies will not be difficult to find later. Accountants are required everywhere. But Mason really loved everything about architecture and could talk about his work for hours. Betty loved to listen to his stories and look into the enthusiastic eyes of her favorite person. She had no doubt Mason would be a great success in life. In their 4th year, the couple decided to consummate their relationship. They were sure of their feelings for each other. "I've found my destiny. It's you," said Mason one day. "I want to be with you all the time, not date you a few times a week. I want to fall asleep and wake up next to you. So what if we're still students? I don't want to wait too long to get married." Betty was happy, smiling. She felt the same way. The prospect of becoming Mason's wife and always being by his side was breathtaking. But parents on both sides actively opposed the ideas of the young ones. motivated by quite logical facts. Both are still studying. On their feet did not become, there is nowhere to live. Where to hurry? Meet and get married later, when you've finished your studies and found a job. And then Betty thought of telling her parents that she was expecting a child. So her mom and dad and her future mother-in-law quickly organized a wedding. That's a lie, of course, said Mason. But what can you do if they need a good reason? It's their own fault, agreed Betty. Well, what if it's true? What if we really have a baby? Mason suggested, I really want us to have a baby. I'm already working. We'll live in my grandmother's empty apartment. I'll finish university. I'll be made the head of the department at once. The chief has already promised me a place, so I'll feed us. That's a great idea. Betty was happy. She suddenly realized that she really wanted a child from the man she loved. It would be the happiest and most beautiful baby in the world. But for some reason, the attempts of the young ones were not successful. The cherished pregnancy did not come. True, then this young married couple did not particularly care. And without that in life was a lot of interesting parties, friends, studies, traveling. When the newlyweds admitted to their parents that there was no child, they didn't even get angry. By that time, adults sincerely loved the second halves of their children and considered their decision to get married a correct and responsible step. They only laughed at the ingenuity of Betty and Mason and hoped that they would not delay their grandchildren. And then, finally, the diploma. Betty and her husband are now young professionals. Mason, as promised, was promoted to department head. Betty got a job as a bookkeeper at the mall. Now they were making their own money for a living. Not much, of course, yet, but their parents continued to help out as a matter of habit. So they had enough not only for food and utilities, but also for fun. How good you are! Callie, Betty's friend, admired her. You've done so well in life. I don't believe in fairy tales about early marriages falling apart, but I've been dumped by a guy again, and all I get are assholes. Betty sincerely pitied the woman who had failed in her personal life and thanked fate for sending her such a faithful, loving, reliable man as Mason. Her friends and coworkers were constantly complaining about their boyfriends and husbands. During these conversations, Betty felt a little awkward. She couldn't keep the conversation going, for she had nothing to reproach Mason with. Time passed. The newlyweds gradually managed to establish a household. Mason and Betty were homeschooled children, cared for by their parents, so household chores were a challenge for both of them at first. It turned out that Betty's long hair quickly clogs the drain, dishes do not wash themselves, dust in the corners accumulates incredibly quickly, and regularly ordered food in the restaurant hurts the family budget. The newlyweds were in for many such surprises. It got to the point that Betty, going to prepare dinner, typed in a search engine phrase, "Where can I get red water for borscht?" The couple withstood the test of everyday life with dignity. Both quickly enough learned to cook and clean, and even made repairs independently in the apartment. Their marriage was waiting for another test of durability. They were married for 5 years, and the family still had no children. Even Kelly managed to give birth to a son. However, she raised her Ethan alone now. His father considered himself too young for such responsibility and disappeared in an unknown direction. But Betty was still almost envious of her friend, looking at her miracle, a tiny cute little baby boy, and desperately dreamed of her own baby. Mason, too, was eager to be a father. The hospitalizations began. Betty was diagnosed with serious reproductive problems. Medications, ultrasounds, tests, treatments. All this exhausts both mentally and physically, but for the sake of her dream, the girl did not give up. Mason was by her side and supported her spouse in everything. Probably, this is our punishment for lying to our parents then, as if we were expecting a child. Betty sighed sorrowfully, looking at another negative pregnancy test. Come on, we meant well, and we didn't do anything wrong. And don't get upset. Everything will work out. But it didn't. When all possible treatments had been tried, the doctor recommended echo. Betty and Mason were sure they would soon be parents. But 3 tries and no success. Betty lay on the bed and just stared at the ceiling. There was no more strength left to cry. She realized she was never going to be a mother. It was all useless, and she didn't want to torture her own body, to hope again and then be disappointed. And then Mason came up. Shall we try again? He said. Only once. I read the forums. Some people only get it on the 8th, 9th try. We're on our 4th. Let's do it. 4th try, and that's it. If we fail again, we'll take a kid from the orphanage. Do you agree? Betty jumped up on the bed. She once suggested her husband to look at orphan profiles, but he flatly refused. He wanted a child of his own blood. He didn't want to raise a stranger's son or daughter, but Betty didn't care. She dreamed of giving love and warmth to a tiny, defenseless human being, even if not born by her. This desire overshadowed all others, filled the woman's thoughts. Mason remained adamant. He argued about bad genetics, the difficulties of adaptation. He didn't want another man's child, and he had every right to. Betty accepted his opinion. So her husband offers to take the baby from the orphanage, but before that he asks for another chance at a native hair. Of course, this time Betty happily agreed to the echo. She was going to the procedure in a completely different mood. One way or another, soon her cherished dream will come true. She will become a mother. It is not known what played a major role, the new therapy or Betty's positive attitude. But it wasn't until this 4th time that everything worked out. Betty looked at the 2-strike test and cried with happiness. And soon Mason joined her. The pregnancy was difficult. Betty was often hospitalized. Mason completely took over the household and almost blew the dust off his wife. He honored her every request, anticipated her every wish, even asked her to quit her job. You don't need to go there now. Nerves unnecessary waste. Rest better, have a baby, grow up a little, and find you a new job. My salary is enough for everything, and next year I'll be promoted. Betty happily plunged into the life of a housewife. A beloved, loving husband, a cozy new apartment, and soon there will be a baby. What more do you need to be happy? Oh, Betty, you are a clever woman. You have organized your life so well. My friend Kelly, who often came to visit, said approvingly, not like me, a single mother who is torn between work and my son. Ethan was already in 1st grade. Kelly did look tired, thin, anxious, always in a hurry. There's a reason I told you at the club. Don't let him get away. He's a great guy. Remember what I said? I do. Betty agreed. She'd texted Mason the wrong phone number that night, and if he hadn't followed them to the club, none of this would be happening now. It's scary to imagine. And then Molly was born. There was no limit to the happiness of the young parents and the newfound grandparents. Now their family became even stronger and happier. True, Betty, after a long treatment, difficult pregnancy, and childbirth, began to have problems with blood pressure. She often felt ill. Mason in these moments perfectly coped with the baby, bathed his daughter, fed her from a bottle, entertained the baby, even swaddled the newborn. And he was just as good at it as Betty. Molly grew up bright and active, but very sickly. She often caught colds and bronchitis in the garden, so Betty had to delay going to work. The maternity leave dragged on until her daughter was 5, and then Kelly invited her best friend to her firm, there was just a vacancy, so the women became colleagues. Life fell into place. Molly was already a first grader. Betty worked. Mason became the head of a large branch of his company, which was located in Boston. There were no money problems. Her husband provided for the family. Betty thought their relationship was perfect. Yes, there wasn't much romance anymore. Sometimes it was very lacking. But after all, they had been together for so many years, it was normal. The main thing was trust, reliability, mutual support. And now this conversation. Betty felt like she couldn't handle the pressure. It seemed to her that these health problems were in the past. Then after giving birth, Mason found the best doctors for her. The new mom got the right therapy, and she forgot about the headaches for years. But now such stress and they're back. By evening, Mason couldn't take it anymore and called his wife an ambulance. She was diagnosed with hypertension and taken to the hospital. She had to lie down for about a week. During that time, the woman pulled herself together. She has no right to beat herself up like that. She has a small daughter and a beloved husband. Yes, he made a mistake, but Betty doesn't know the situation. Maybe it's Jenna, the unknown Jenna, who has tricked him around. Betty is not going to give up just like that. She's been building her strong, happy family for a long time. She and Mason have done everything possible and impossible together. And now she's gonna give her husband to some skank? No way! That's the last thing we need. Molly needs a father. She needs a reliable, caring husband. Betty will fight for her family. This decision gave the woman strength and vigor. There was plenty of time at the hospital to get busy searching for the beautiful stranger. Betty only knew her name so far, but in the age of social media, that was enough. First of all, the woman set about monitoring her husband's accounts. Mason had a lot of friends and subscribers, colleagues, friends, partners, just acquaintances. Jenna among them was enough. Betty rejected ladies of age immediately. Then it was the turn of women who did not reach the aesthetic tastes of her husband. Mason always preferred beautiful, slender, well-groomed girls like Betty herself. The remaining Jenna beauties from her husband's pages were 3. These young women didn't look too suspicious, all of them showing off their own happy families on social media. Their profiles were littered with photos of their other halves. Who knows who they are, though? It's not a fact that Mason's mistress is single. How many cases when married ladies decide to have a little fun and make a friend on the side? And yet Betty's intuition told her that Jenna wasn't one of them. Suddenly, the search engine gave Betty several accounts with a note. Perhaps you two know each other. Among them was Liam, a colleague of Mason's from the Boston branch. In the main profile photo, he was clearly posing from a corporate event, with their company logo in the background. Betty was interested. Her husband had never shown her pictures from the parties he'd flown to Boston for. He said he wasn't interested in collecting that garbage, and he hated being photographed. And now Betty wanted to see how their corporate holidays were going. If Liam had put a photo from the party on the cover, he'd probably have a couple more on his profile. Betty went to the page of her husband's colleague, and as she expected, he had a whole album of photos from corporate parties. The woman started flipping through the photos with interest. She noticed her husband in some of them. He seemed to be deliberately hiding from the cameras, and the photographer managed to capture only a glimpse of him, in a half-turn or from the back. Betty smiled. Mason hadn't liked to be photographed since he was a child. His mother had told me a funny story about it, but it wasn't long before the woman wasn't laughing. The next photo featured the 3 of them, Liam, Mason, and a beautiful, bright young woman with chiseled facial features. Betty's husband stood in the center. The lady was clinging to him in an overly possessive way, and he was naturally and habitually putting his arm around her slim waist. Something wasn't right here. Betty shifted her eyes downward. Each of the characters in the photos were labeled Mason and Jenna. Jenna. Betty seemed to have accidentally stumbled upon the one she was looking for. The woman quickly navigated to the girl's page. There were many pictures of her. The beauty clearly loved being photographed. You bet, with such appearance, just a supermodel. Jenna at a resort. Jenna in a luxurious restaurant. Jenna in the pool, and everywhere alone. How could a hottie like Jenna be alone? She can't be. I bet she's got a lot of dates. And suddenly Betty saw a picture from the sea. It was obviously some foreign resort. White sand, bright sunshine, palm trees, turquoise waves. Jenna was photographing the beautiful landscape. In the frame, apparently, accidentally got a man. He stood with his back to the lens. But Betty recognized her husband, his figure, the birthmark on his neck, and the t-shirt that she herself gave him. There was no doubt. This was the same Jenna her husband had called to New York for her business trip. The same mistress. And they're serious. They're even traveling to the sea together. Mason must have explained those trips to her as business trips, of which he'd had too many lately. Well, at least now Betty knows the enemy. Jenna was in her final year of university when she met Mason. It happened in a bar where she and a classmate were celebrating the end of the session. A handsome young man in an expensive business suit was relaxing at a neighboring table with a few friends, or rather colleagues. Those two were dressed in strict jackets and pants. Businessmen, probably. Christina, Jenna's dorm roommate and classmate, looked at them. They're all so cool. Come on, they're old for us, and they're probably married. Just let me dream. So cool, well-groomed, not like our guys. Continued to admire Christina. Having a couple of glasses of wine, she always became kinder to the opposite sex. Every man seemed to her almost a prince on a white horse. But the men in this nearby company did look attractive. Stylish, trim, handsome. One of them stood out in particular, gray-eyed, with a wide, white-toothed smile that made dimples appear on his cheeks. Jenna tried not to look in his direction. Look, they're looking at us, Christina said admiringly. Of course, you yourself do not take your eyes off them. So they look at you and are surprised. Calm down. Jenna, they are coming to us. Indeed, soon one of the men, not the one Jenna liked, came to their table. He introduced himself as Liam and asked Christina to dance with him. She gladly agreed. Jenna finished her cocktail and watched the dancing of her friend, who, apparently, decided to get closer to the beau by all means. But another man, the oldest of the group, with an expensive watch on his arm and stylish glasses, separated from the table. Good evening. He introduced himself, taking a seat next to Jenna. What is it that such a beautiful girl is sad here alone? What a banal approach. From the representative of the older generation, Jenna expected something original. I'm not sad about being alone. I'm enjoying it. The girl not too subtly hinted at being left alone, but the newfound admirer did not give up. My name is James. He introduced himself. I just can't resist your beauty. You look like a young Nicole Kidman. Has anyone ever told you that? More than once. Can I ask you your name? No, you don't have to say no so flatly. You just don't realize you're missing out on a great opportunity I could give you. Give me some peace for starters. Jenna was getting annoyed. That Christina, she is there on the dance floor with her handsome man, and she has to fight off an obsessive suitor who does not understand neither hints nor direct refusals. James, meanwhile, had moved closer to Jenna, and he was drunk. That partly explained his lack of judgment. Surely in ordinary life, this man is tactful and intelligent. Some people shouldn't drink at all. They turn into such animals. James put his hand on the back of Jenna's chair and looked at the girl with admiring eyes. It was unpleasant. She stood up, intending to leave, but the man held her hand, his palm firmly around her wrist. "Where are you going? We haven't even met yet." "I have to go. I'll walk you out." James jumped up from his seat. He never let go of my hand. "Let me go already." Jenna shouted loudly. He didn't think to loosen his grip. Perhaps he couldn't hear or understand what he was saying, the cocktails playing no small part in his behavior. James, instead of letting go of Jenna, suddenly hugged her. It was too much. The girl moved as hard as she could at the insolent man, her elbow right into his soft belly, and he awed and opened his arms for a moment. The man's eyes flashed with malice. It frightened the girl. Anything could be expected from a drunken stranger. She tried to slip away, but he grabbed her again. This time roughly and very tightly. Jenna felt pain. "We need to talk. Sit down," James asked. "James, what are you doing?" "Calm down." The gray-eyed man approached them. Fortunately, he noticed what was going on at the table and rushed to help, either to rescue his friend from possible trouble or to protect the girl. For some reason, Jenna immediately felt safe and realized that everything was going to work out. Why would she? James' speech became more and more incoherent. Two other men from the company came up to them and took the clueless comrade to their table. "You excuse him." The gray-eyed one smiled. "I had a little too much to drink, and today the deal was closed, so here's a note." "Thank you," replied Jenna. She couldn't take her eyes off the man's beautiful, intelligent eyes. The girl just drowned in them. He looked even more attractive up close than he looked from afar. For some reason, she wanted to run her hand over his cheeks, touched with light stubble. That had never happened to her before. Jenna painfully invented an excuse to prolong communication with the gray-eyed man. She did not want to part with him. Fate had taken pity on her, and everything had worked itself out. And Mason, Liam, and Christina, who had been dancing, came to the table. "Come on, land here. Look how cool the girls are." Christina laughed foolishly with adoration, looking at her beau. Mason stayed at the table, and Jenna realized it was because of her. A hot wave ran through her whole body. She was drawn to Mason more and more, like a magnet pulling her. Mason was a very interesting and witty conversationalist. He seemed to be able to hold a conversation on any topic, and Jenna wanted to agree with his opinions every time. She wished the evening would never end. It was unlikely that she would ever meet this man who had such a strange influence on her again. From the table conversations, the girl realized that he lives and works in Boston and came here on a business trip. Mason, to Jenna's disappointment, did not even try to get her phone number. Most likely he is married, and he does not need a relationship on the side. Yes, the girl felt that she liked Mason, and it was very pleasant, but he behaved as restrained as possible, not showing his sympathy in any way. Jenna hoped that she did not give away her sudden feelings either. Until now, she hadn't understood what passion, love, and other concepts from romantic books and movies meant. It seemed to her that all of these were fictitious categories, that they didn't really exist. But now she was in a whirlpool of feelings, and she had no idea what to do with it all. The evening was rapidly drawing to a close. The bar closes at 200 hours. Christina and Liam decided to take a cab and go for a walk. They called Masana and Jenna, but the man refused at once, saying that he had an important meeting in the afternoon. Jenna thought of some reason not to go with the couple. When Christina and Liam drove off into the night, Mason offered to walk Jenna home. Her heart raced. Was what had been dreamed of all evening really happening? She'd really hit it off, and they'd start a relationship. Without witnesses, he would finally dare to take a step towards her. His heart fluttered in joyful anticipation. In the cab, the girl waited for Mason to kiss her, or at least to embrace her, but he again behaved a little aloofly, though he joked and smiled a lot. And already on the porch of the student dormitory, he took Jenna's phone number. She gladly dictated the numbers to him and realized that from that moment, she would live in anticipation of a call. It didn't take long to wait. Mason called the very next day, invited to the movie. After the movie, they walked along the waterfront, then stopped by a luxurious restaurant. Jenna had been living in Boston for 5 years, but she had no idea that there were such places here. She felt a little uncomfortable, but Mason helped her relax, just covered her hand with his palm, and all the anxiety, worry, awkwardness disappeared as if it had never happened. Then he offered to go to his place. Of course, Jenna knew what that meant, and Mason realized that she knew what she was getting into, so he didn't insist, gave her the right to choose. Jenna agreed without the slightest hesitation. The corporate apartment was as upscale and presentable as Mason himself, stylish, bright, spacious, modern, and clearly designed by a designer. Jenna didn't realize whether the company had bought the apartment for Mason or whether it was just renting it to an employee, because the latter was often in Boston. That's how they started dating. That first night, the couple was cozy on the couch in the living room. Mason suggested Jenna not to go to the hostel at night, but to stay with him. The girl gladly accepted the invitation. She did not want to part with Mason. And here they were watching some show on TV and eating rolls ordered from the restaurant, drinking insanely delicious champagne. Finally, the girl decided on an important question, which did not give her a rest. "And you, were you married?" she asked. "Yes, does it matter?" Jenna thought for a moment. On the one hand, it really didn't matter. She feels happy around Mason. She wants to see the face and smell the smell of the man she loves, to feel his touch and bathe in his admiration and care, and to be a part of his beautiful life. Yes, Jenna wasn't lying to herself. She liked that Mason was so successful and wealthy, but that wasn't the only thing that attracted her to him. Far from it. And the wife, she was somewhere far away, New York. What did it matter if she even existed or not? On the other hand, Jenna realized that it is not good to have an affair with a married man. It is always a betrayal, and the outcome is often sad, even tragic sometimes. The girl herself many times lectured her friend Christina when she was too fond of unfree men. And yet, still Mason attracted Jenna, charmed, mesmerized. For the sake of being near him, she was ready to go over all her principles and moral turmoil. After all, Jenna is not going to take him out of the family, at least not until she is enough to feel, at least sometimes as a woman, this strong, confident, and intelligent man. Mason has shown Jenna a very different life. The girl came to Boston to study from the village, and it took a long time to get used to the city. There was a time when she was even shy to go with her classmates to cheap cafes and eateries. In her village, she did not see anything like that. Such places seemed to her too luxurious. She felt in them some lost and ridiculous. Gradually, Jenna settled in Boston. It was easier and more fun to adapt with her roommate, Christina, a country girl like her. Looking at other students and following their advice, Jenna learned to dress and make up so as to favorably emphasize the advantages of her appearance. And movie halls, cafes and bars soon stopped scaring her. Boys, students, and even teachers began to pay attention to Jenna. The girl realized the power of her beauty, but was not in a hurry to use it to the fullest, not like Christina, who seemed to try to take from her freshness and youth all at once. Jenna, however, having seen different stories in her village, and in the city too, had made up her mind. First she would study, get on her feet, and then she would organize her personal life, surely with a worthy and successful man. They will have a wonderful family, a perfect one. Jenna will never again live in the poverty of her childhood, and she will not return to her village. On the contrary, she will bring her mother and brother here. The girl had global plans, and she confidently went to the goal. She studied at her pedagogical university, but she did not plan to work as a teacher of biology and geography. She thought that after graduation, she would find something more prestigious and highly paid. Entering this department right after school, the girl did not think much about the prospects. She went to the place where she had enough points, and the competition was small. And now Mason appeared in her life, and with him, trips to restaurants, luxurious gifts, long conversations on interesting topics, vivid impressions, new acquaintances. Not even 2 months after the beginning of their relationship, as Mason offered Jenna to fly with him for a few days to Thailand. The girl with pleasure plunged into this beautiful sea fairy tale. Later such trips became quite frequent. Mason could easily explain his absence to the family by business trips and business trips. Jenna, on the other hand, tried not to think about the fact that her man had another life, a wife and a daughter in New York. Of course, she almost immediately looked through her lover's social networks and saw pictures of his wife. Beautiful, successful woman, quite harmoniously looked in a pair with imposing Mason. Together they looked just perfect. Jenna could not help but recognize this fact, although it hurt her. The girl didn't plan to fall in love with Mason, or anyone at all. She had other goals for now, but she couldn't help it. Even yesterday, Jenna was an ordinary student who often had to eat instant noodles for dinner, even with Christina sometimes sharing this treat. She counted a small scholarship and saved on everything, and today she knew by sight the staff of the most elite establishments in Boston. She herself now lived in the very Mason corporate apartment that had so delighted her in a stylish studio, packed to the brim with tricked-out appliances, with a spacious bathtub. Jenna liked to lie in it with a flute of cold champagne, like the girls in the movies about the beautiful life. Mason flew to Boston every month, sometimes more than once. It was required by work issues, but Jenna suspected that his business trips became so frequent because of her too. The girl realized that Mason really took her very seriously, not as just another mistress. And he wasn't the type to change women like a glove. Jenna knew that this was Mason's first and only relationship on the side, and she could see that the man was very uncomfortable with the fact that he had to lie to his wife, but he couldn't give up on Jenna. When the girl graduated from the university, Mason got her a job in his branch in the Human Resources Department. Jenna had to learn a lot practically from scratch to master a new specialty, but she coped, and she liked the work very much. And the salary, almost every month coming with a solid bonus, and quite happy. The girl realized that without experience, right from the university bench, she would never have found a place with such a salary if not for Mason, and she was grateful to him for the opportunity to get on her feet. It was very important to her. Time passed in the company. Some of the employees, of course, began to speculate about the relationship between the branch manager and Jenna. They talked and got used to it. The girl cared little about it, but she realized that sooner or later some well-wisher would report everything to Mason's wife. And what would happen then? It was difficult to suppose, Yet years passed, but everything remained the same. Perhaps the 1,000 miles separating New York and Betty was released from the hospital. She was now completely well, both physically and mentally. She realized that she would fight for the man she loved and for her family. This decision gave her strength and confidence, but Betty needed allies, no one but her faithful friend Kelly to tell her the details of the story. "What a mess," Kelly said thoughtfully after listening to Betty. The women were sitting in a coffee shop, not far from the office. It was the only place to get away from the ears of their co-workers. "Yes, these are pies. I never would have thought that about Mason, the perfect husband and father from the outside. The weird thing is, he's a really great husband and father. They've been together for 4 years, and I had no idea. With his schedule, it's no wonder, constantly on the road, it's easy to hide not just a mistress, but a second family. Well, what have you decided? How will you proceed?" "Fight for my husband," Betty replied confidently. "I want Mason to realize that I am worth more to him than he is, and that no young beauty is worth losing his family. I'd like to do it without Mason realizing that I know about his relationship." "So you don't have a specific plan?" Kelly clarified. "What kind of plan? I don't have a lot of information. I only know her name and that she works at the Boston branch, which is probably where Mason put her. But I've seen pictures of her, and she's very pretty. So we need more information." Kelly concluded. Betty really liked it, us. She realized she now had a solid support in the person of her best friend. "We do." Betty agreed, but where would she get that information? "I don't know any of Mason's colleagues in Boston. I can't even ask them. I have an idea." Kelly suddenly had an idea. "Really, what is it?" "Wait, I don't want to get your hopes up yet. I'll call you tonight." And her friend kept her promise. Indeed, called in the evening and outlined her simple, like all things brilliant plan. Kelly's brother had a friend who was an IT specialist. He helped Betty install a program that she could now use to control her husband's social networking and messenger accounts. "If you don't know me, I don't know you." Half jokingly, half seriously, the young man warned. Betty could now see all of her husband's correspondence with family and friends, co-workers, partners, but most importantly with her, with the young blue-eyed Jenna who had intruded into their family. Of course, the woman felt some remorse because she had so treacherously invaded the personal space of the man she loved. But on the other hand, he had done far worse to her. Betty quickly realizes that things between Jenna and Mason are quite serious. She lives in his corporate apartment, cooking him delicious dinners there when Mason flies to Boston on business. Apparently, she tries very hard, specifically looking for exquisite recipes, not like Betty herself. Work and a child take so much energy and time, so she has recently had enough only for pasta and sausages, and the apartment is often not cleaned. However, Mason has never once expressed dissatisfaction with the domestic moments. On the contrary, when time allowed him, he took care of household chores without any indulgence, but maybe he still lacked care and attention, Betty. With the arrival of the long-awaited child, the woman did indeed spend much less time with her husband. Perhaps what happened was her fault. No, that's the wrong way to think about it. It's not easy for her either. But it's not like she went looking for a comforting lover. Mason and Jenna occasionally flew together for vacations. Betty realized this from the correspondence, in which there were phrases like "when we were in Italy" or "resorts by the warm sea, we've been many times before. I want to try something new. Maybe the Scandinavian countries? Sounds like they've traveled halfway around the world. That was a shame." Betty was sympathetic to her husband's busy schedule. Yes, They didn't spend much time together, but the woman believed that her husband was working for the good of their family. And now it turned out that many of these business trips were just a cover for traveling with Jenna. Reading the correspondence, Betty realized a lot. This girl is really in love with Mason, and him. Jenna gives him what her husband cannot get in the family: passion, free time, vivid emotions, blind adoration. But if he was really ready to leave his wife for her, he would have done it already. Mason is clearly serious about Jenna, but apparently doesn't really love her. Except things can change. For example, the young mistress will give him a child, and then Mason will never leave them. Or anything else for that matter. Slowly Jenna can bind her man to herself, make him fall in love with himself. So she had to act decisively and as quickly as possible, but she couldn't come up with a plan. And Kelly couldn't offer any advice. "I'm a single mom. What kind of counselor am I?" she said, confused. "Just know that if you need my help, I'm always here for you." "Thank you. You've been so helpful. At least now I know the ins and outs of their relationship." "What's it like? How does it feel to know your husband's not going on a business trip?" But to her, it hurts, Betty admitted. But it's still better than being in the dark. Jenna had been thinking about starting her own business for a long time. She decided to try to open several dispensing centers of a popular online store. The girl thoroughly studied all the necessary information and made a business plan, but the accumulated funds were clearly not enough to start. Jenna was sure that Mason would gladly help her. He always supported all her endeavors and encouraged her development in any sphere. This time, too, Mason was pleased with the idea of a mistress. "That's a wonderful idea," he praised it, "and the direction is promising. With paperwork, if anything, I'll help. Only I do not have enough money." And Jenna voiced the missing amount, quite decent, but not astronomical for Mason. "I can't take out so much at once. I'll fly to New York. You remind me, I'll transfer it." As it was agreed, Jenna sent Mason a text message with a reminder about the money transfer. Her lover never refused her anything. The girl was used to it, so she had no doubt that now she would get what she wanted. But the message about crediting the funds did not come, and time was running out. It was necessary to pay rent, advertising, utilities, and purchase racks for storage. So Jenna texted Mason again, to which she received a reply that he was looking into the matter. Eventually, Mason called and informed her in a frustrated voice that it wasn't going to work out. His family urgently needed money for something. Jenna did not get into the details. The man promised that he would definitely help her next month. The girl leaned back in her chair. Now she clearly felt second best. The family needed money, and Mason had chosen his wife in this situation, easily and without the slightest doubt. Next to him, Jenna was used to feeling superior to everyone else. Perhaps she was even in love with this self-perception, but now the girl fully saw the disadvantages of her status. She is only a mistress. Not even entitled to take offense, Mason does so much for her as it is. Betty, of course, read a text message from Jenna in which the mistress reminded Mason that he promised to give her money for business development. That message both pleased and angered the woman. At the same time pleased by the fact that the girl apparently takes good advantage of her husband's opportunities. Mason cannot ignore this. He is far from being a fool. The easier it will be to convince him of the mercantile interest of the mistress, which against the background of sincere love and affection of his wife, will look especially ugly. And Betty was outraged that Jenna is too bossy with her husband's resources, and he, apparently, easily follows her lead. "No way, Jenna. You're out of the family budget." That evening, Mason was late for work, and Betty had time to prepare a delicious dinner. Sitting at the table, her husband marveled at her culinary skills and praised the dishes. "Better than a restaurant," husband confessed. "I'm glad you like it," smiled Betty. "How was your day?" "The usual." "It was fine." "I've just had my infinity breakdown," Betty confessed. "Infinity?" Mason was surprised. "I just bought you a car a while ago. It's a good, reliable car. I'll send the mechanics over tomorrow." "No need. I'd already took it to the service myself. It needs repair. Expensive." "How much?" And then Betty said an amount only a little less than what the mistress had asked. Mason stopped talking, thinking. Betty realized he was considering whether he could help both his wife and Jenna at the same time, and deciding who to sponsor first. A lot depended on his choice now, and his wife helped him make it. "I need a car urgently. Molly has a competition soon, training every day. I can't miss it, and I have to travel a lot for work every day. You know we have locations all over the city." Mason immediately transferred the necessary amount of money to Betty at the table. And then a little later the woman read a message from her husband, in which he justified himself to Jenna. The mistress never received the promised funds. What pleased Betty most was the fact that Mason had chosen her over Jenna. After all, the mistress also had a good enough reason. She wanted to start her own business, and yet her husband had helped his wife. Jenna must have noticed that, and now she's suffering. Serves her right. Let her know her place. The money situation upset Jenna and even disappointed her, but she pulled herself together and life went on as usual. The following month Mason did find the missing funds for her, and the girl started her business. She had a wise assistant and mentor in the person of her favorite man, so the experience was successful. Soon the invested money began to bring a good income. True, Jenna had more worries, but she even liked such business. She had no time and energy to think about her unenviable position as a mistress. She simply enjoyed Mason's presence in her life, his attention, his support, his patronage. She was still fascinated by his gray eyes, and she still melted at his touch as surely as she had on the first day of their acquaintance. Christmas was approaching, her favorite holiday since childhood. Jenna loved the scent of pine needles. She was mesmerized by the colorful lights, garlands. She was no longer a little girl, but as before, she associated the end of December with the expectation of a miracle, and this time the miracle really happened. Mason sent a text message asking her to buy a beautiful new swimsuit instead of an evening gown for the corporate party. He suggested we fly together to the Arab Emirates on New Year's Eve weekend. Getting away for a few days from the hustle and bustle that always accompanies the end of the year sounded delightful. Of course, Jenna replied that she gladly accepted the offer and went to the mall that same day. She wanted to look flawless for Mason on this vacation. Jenna liked to see his rapturous gaze, to hear the compliments she received. So she picked up a beach closet, maximally emphasizing the numerous advantages of her appearance. The girl was sure that not only Mason will admire her on the beach. Let her lover see what success his girl enjoys with others. Jenna had read somewhere that it greatly increases the value of the chosen one in the eyes of men. The girl was already anticipating how they would splash in the warm waters of the Persian Gulf and rock out at the local discos, and then rest in the luxurious apartments of the hotel. The trip promised to be wonderful. Jenna tried to behave with restraint, but in the end she could not resist the handsome student from England. He was 3 years younger than her and seemed to have a real crush on the American girl. Although Jenna immediately told him that their romance was purely resort for only a few days. The young man made her feel needed and admirable again, but Jenna realized that neither he nor anyone else could replace Mason. The pre-holiday weekend flew by like a blink of an eye. It was time to go home. Jenna realized that she missed Mason very much and was ready to forgive him anything. Although, of course, as they say, the resentment was gone, but the residue remained. Betty felt like a winner again. They just had a wonderful couple of days at the base, skiing and tubing, walking through the winter forest, roasting meat, drinking spicy mulled wine, playing board games in a big and friendly group. We laughed a lot and talked about interesting topics. Betty listened to a lot of thanks for the fact that she had guessed to bring everyone together and organize this trip. Most importantly, they were together at this time, Betty, Mason, Molly. There was no rushing or hurrying anywhere. Fully enjoying each other's company and hugging and laughing all the time. Betty decided that they needed to do this kind of outing more often. All of this was clearly good for their relationship. At first, Mason seemed anxious and lost. Apparently, he couldn't stop thinking about the lonely Jenna, but then he relaxed, calmed down, and began to enjoy the winter vacation. And the mistress flew to Dubai with a friend. That was wonderful. Betty sincerely hoped that she would meet some rich man there and not return to the USA. Why? Jenna is a blue-eyed blonde, a real beauty, so this option is quite possible. But as much as Betty didn't want it, the problem didn't solve itself. Jenna came back and immediately started texting Mason about how much she missed him. That was okay. Betty wasn't going to give up. Jenna had a favorite little brother. She'd raised him since he was a baby, helping his busy, tired mother. Now David was all grown up, 18 years old. Time has flown by quickly. From a cute, blonde-haired little kid, he turned into a handsome young man. He entered a sports college and was given a dormitory. Charles began his student life, of course. He often came to his sister. She was always happy to invite her relative and even helped him with money. But the young man wanted to earn money himself. "I'm looking for a job," one day he confessed to Jenna. "They promised to take me as a courier in the delivery service. You'll be in the snow and in the cold to travel around the city with a huge box on your shoulders." My sister shook her head. "And get change for it. You don't even have a car, so you should at least drive it. Otherwise, you'll be walking and taking buses." But what can I do? For now, we'll see. Everyone works somehow. Everyone? Jenna frowned. It's different for everyone. And the older sister reminded her brother of a story that had recently happened in their town. A courier, a young girl, brought an order to an apartment and fell into the clutches of drunken guys. The girl miraculously survived the encounter with the scumbags. But it was a girl. I'm a man. David brushed it off. What's the comparison? You think because you're a guy, you're safe? Well, sort of. David smiled. Come on, you're getting a little shady around town. It used to be quieter. All right, I'll talk to someone. Maybe I can get you a job driving for our firm. There's probably plenty of applicants. Your salaries are good. Yes, there are a lot of applicants. Agreed Jenna. But not every one of them has a sister working in the personnel department. Of course, the girl immediately wrote to Mason. In their branch, there was indeed a vacancy for a driver to unload materials. As a member of the Human Resources Department, Jenna could not help but know about it. The work is not much. The pay is good. David would be able to combine study and work perfectly and would not need money. Mason replied that he would take care of the matter. Jenna was sure that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow she would register her brother for a vacant position. Betty read the post about the vacancy and wondered. Another request that could be used in the struggle for marital happiness. The mistress would again be left with nothing. The woman suddenly remembered that she had a nephew living in Boston. so she dialed the number of a great aunt, his mother. It turned out that the nephew works at a local factory, works hard, and gets change. The situation was perfect. Betty happily told her aunt about the job opening and promised to talk to her husband. "How did you know the Boston branch needed a driver?" Mason looked at his wife in surprise. She had just asked him to hire her great-nephew for the job, describing beforehand how important the relationship with those relatives was to her and how she wanted to help them. "I happened to run into Kathy, your boss's wife, at the mall." Mason wondered how bad the timing of all this was. After all, he'd promised a spot to Jenna's brother. "She's gonna be upset again, but we already found someone." "Mason, I called Human Resources. The position is still vacant. Say no to that person. Say it's taken." "Do you have any idea what my aunt did for me?" "I just have to pay her back. A good job for her son is what's needed." "Oh, please, for my sake." Mason heartily texted Jenna to tell her that he couldn't take her brother's job. Of course, the girl was upset. Resentment squeezed her heart. She even threw a plate on the floor in a fit of anger. Again, she was sidetracked. And the next day, the new driver added fuel to the fire. A radiant young man came to apply for a job. He happily shared that he had been told about the position by his great-aunt from New York, the wife of the Boston branch manager, Mason. So once again, Betty, without realizing it herself, had screwed things up. Jenna felt herself slowly beginning to hate the woman. She was the reason Mason repeatedly rejected her requests, and he was becoming more and more frustrating. It seemed that Mason was gradually burning out. Their protracted relationship was becoming more and more like a habit. Jenna was very sad to realize it, because the girl still wanted to be near him, to hear his voice, to see attentive gray eyes, and yet the girl realized more and more clearly that their romance would lead to nothing. She had realized it from the beginning, but then passion overshadowed all rational thoughts. Jenna felt herself next to Mason exceptional and unique. He seemed willing to do anything for her. Mason really did a lot for Jenna, but lately his attention was clearly not enough for her. He was always dealing with family problems, working a lot. It was so humiliating to be on the sidelines, especially with so many available men around who would be happy to be near her. "Come visit me this weekend. I miss you so much," asked Jenna. Mason hadn't been in Boston in over a month. "Baby, I can't. There's a lot of work at the head office. Maybe it's the wife again." Mason sighed. He must have loved Jenna in his own way. He sure did. Why else couldn't he break off a relationship that had grown too serious? He liked a lot of things about her. Good looks, determination, wisdom. Despite her youth, Jenna was remarkably adequate. She never threw tantrums, never drove him crazy. Mason was sure that she would not get pregnant in order to marry him, and would not call Betty with offers to leave her husband. But lately, Jenna has been a little too jealous of his wife. Yes, indeed, there have been several incidents in which Mason has shown that family is more important to him than anything else, but he's never hidden that from Jenna. He admitted on their first date that he wasn't single, and several times during their time together, the man was ready to let her go when she wanted to leave. But Jenna had always come back, and Mason had been genuinely happy about it. He'd probably gotten used to having her around by now. Beautiful, in love, not too demanding, understanding. It was a shame that her behavior was changing. But maybe it's just some crisis in the relationship. It's necessary to be patient a little, and everything will be back to normal. Jenna sat with a glass of champagne, in a bubble bath. Being a village girl from a poor family, she never dreamed of such a life. A high-paying job, luxurious interiors, her own small business, a beautiful car, and a man she loved. True, things were not so smooth with the man. He belonged to another, and lately it was indicated more and more often and more vividly. Just at one moment, everything went wrong, as if someone upstairs decided that Jenna had enough personal happiness. Mason's not coming again, citing work, but it's probably all about family. I wondered if she needed help. Would he give up his wife, his kid, his office to support her? I'd have to see if he'd lie. But it's a test, and the future of their relationship depends on how Mason reacts. If he drops everything and flies to her, they'll be together. No. Jenna will pack her things and go to her mother's village for a few months, quit her job. Mason will be there. The business will be entrusted to Christina for the time being. She's her right-hand woman now. Her friend's in the loop. She'll be fine without her. And Jenna will get over her illness, cry and go back to being free. But that's plan B. The girl still hoped Mason would rush to her like he used to. Maybe in time he would even leave his wife, and they would build a family of their own. The phone clicked with a special beep, meaning Mason had a message from Jenna. Betty quickly read it. Okay, that makes sense. New request. The mistress is complaining to her husband about feeling awful vascular problems and wild headaches. I can't do anything. Probably have to go to the hospital. I need help with my business and personal support from my loved one. Betty thought about it. Her intuition told her it was a lie. Jenna is a young girl in the prime of life. The woman had seen the recent pictures she had sent her husband on a regular basis. In them, Jenna was strikingly fresh. Clean, radiant skin, light blush, bright eyes. Looking at the pictures, Betty thought that youth was still beautiful in itself. The girl clearly didn't look sick. Of course, all sorts of things happen. Her hypertensive crisis came on suddenly. But even if Jenna was really sick, let her heal herself. She was not a little girl. Mason took her to a high-paying position, helped her to establish a business, so the money for treatment at Madam clearly has, and care and attention let and demand from close relatives. No, Betty will not let her husband go to Boston anytime soon. Except that she has to come up with a reason, but she'll manage. Lately, Betty felt like she was just a generator of ideas. It didn't take long to think of one. When Betty was picking up her daughter from figure skating practice, she noticed a colorful poster on the wall of the sports center. A grand performance of the section's pupils at the big stadium was planned. The show promised to be bright and colorful. Betty approached Coach Molly. Hello, why isn't my daughter in the show? Molly's not ready yet. She has great prospects. Next year she will definitely show herself, but right now. Perhaps she needs extra lessons? I'm ready to pay for them, as long as my daughter gets to this concert. You see, we have elderly relatives visiting us. This may be the last time they come to New York. If they could see Molly, it would make them happy. I understand, but does your section need new equipment? If you put Molly on the program, I'll get it for you. All right. With apparent reluctance, the coach agreed. Only Molly will have a cameo. She is still small, and it doesn't matter. Betty shined. The main thing is that Molly will perform. At dinner, Mason said that the day after tomorrow, he would be flying to Boston to solve some work issues. Couldn't the business trip be rescheduled? Betty pretended to be surprised and upset by the news. Why? Something urgent again? I wanted to tell you such happy news. Our Molly has been accepted to perform at the Ice Palace. She's the smallest person in the show. Can you believe it? Mason looked proudly at his daughter sitting next to him. You're doing great. You're the star of the ice. Yes. Molly lowered her eyes modestly. I'm good. I've worked so hard, and now I'm going to perform. You're coming to watch, right, Daddy? Mason looked into his daughter's hopeful eyes. The man's choice was obvious. Jenna would soon receive another rejection. Another Betty-directed situation that should contribute to the destruction of the relationship, mistress and husband. Jenna was packing her things. She did not want to leave her apartment, which for 4 years had become almost native. But the girl was determined. This time she is definitely leaving Mason. He has shown her time and time again that family is more important to him. Jenna will always be in second place for him, even perhaps in third place. Then there's the job she adores. She's already bought the train tickets at the office. She herself has drawn up an order for her dismissal. The story's over. Jenna realized that she wanted to be the only one for her man. Perhaps it was time to start a family of her own. Christina recently got married and is now expecting a son. Looking at the family happiness, friends, Jenna realized that she dreams of the same, but a husband and a child. All of this is unthinkable while she's in a relationship with Mason. It was time to put a stop to it. Jenna no longer resented Mason, only the pain of knowing he loved another woman. The man had done so much for her, the girl felt grateful to him, and she would be sure to tell him that to his face or over the phone. But later, not now. Now it is necessary to wait it out, to get over it, to hide for a while. And then a new life would begin. Mason watched Molly's performance. He had come to the Ice Palace with a tricked-out professional camera. Betty watched as he tried to catch his daughter in the frame, not often succeeding. Just as the coach had warned, Molly flashed in the back rows, but the proud father didn't seem to notice. His eyes burned with genuine admiration for his child. Next to him lay a bouquet of roses prepared for the little star. Then the phone beeped again, the same beep that had alerted him to messages from Jenna. Mason didn't pay attention to the sound. He was completely absorbed in his daughter's performance, and Betty, of course, immediately read the text message and smiled victoriously. Jenna asked him not to look for her. She said it was over between them. She even quit her job at the Mason branch so she wouldn't have to see him. Sounds like a win to me. Although, of course, it's too soon to relax. Mason, back in his empty Boston apartment, felt an acute sense of guilt. Taken 4 years of Jenna's life. She could have met her destiny, gotten married, had children instead of wasting her youth on a futile relationship. His conscience was soothed only by the fact that he still helped this girl to establish a business and become financially independent. But the sadness and regret that he and Jenna were not together now, strangely enough, was not there. On the contrary, the man even felt relieved. Now he wouldn't have to flit between his wife and his mistress, trying to pay attention to both. There would no longer be that oppressive feeling of guilt in front of Jenna and Betty. The situation had resolved itself. Lucky. Betty was celebrating the victory with her best friend Kelly. The women were sitting at a pizza place near their office. It was lunch hour. Good for you. Kelly praised the woman. She overcame her resentment, was able to forgive the man she loved, and kept her family together. She pulled it off so masterfully, and it's like she had nothing to do with it. Yes, I'm a strategist, it turns out. Betty agreed. Mason, I think, has come to value family even more. At least he's trying to make time for us. But, Mason's already had an affair. I don't want to scare you, but it's almost certain to happen again if he's capable of it. What are you gonna do then? Well, Betty set her glass down on the table. A cold determination appeared in her gaze. Well, in that case, I already know exactly what to do.